Hello, and welcome to Mythos and Logos. What would make a man leave the fjords of his fathers, the cold, clear waters where his family had fished and farmed for generations beyond counting, to travel thousands of miles through lands he'd never seen, among peoples whose languages he couldn't speak, all to swing an axe in the service of an emperor whose very existence seemed like something from a dream? What kind of wealth, what kind of glory, what kind of transformation could justify such a journey? For more than 300 years, young men from Scandinavia made exactly this choice. They left behind the grey skies and green valleys of the north to travel the great river roads of the east, moving through forests and across steppes, navigating rapids and negotiating with suspicious tribes, until at last they reached a city so magnificent that the Norse could only call it Miklagard, the Great City. We know it as Constantinople. There, these northern warriors would take an oath to guard the life of the Roman emperor with their own, to become the axes upon which an empire's survival would rest. They called themselves, and history would remember them, as the Varangians. Tonight, we will follow these warriors on their journey from the cold seas of Scandinavia to the golden halls of Byzantium. We will walk with them down dangerous rivers, stand with them in the marble corridors of the great palace, and fight beside them in battles that decided the fate of empires. We will discover how men from the forests of the north became the most trusted guardians of the civilized world's greatest power, and how, in serving a foreign emperor, they changed not only their own fates, but the course of history itself. Before we get started, I'd love your support through a quick like and subscription. These simple gestures genuinely keep me motivated to create more. Thank you for being here. And because I enjoy knowing our community, please share in the comments where you're located and whether it's day or night for you. Feel the veil between past and present growing thin as we cross into the cold northern waters of the late 10th century after the death of Christ, where dragon-prowed ships cut through morning mist, and young men dreamed of distant gold, rivers of amber and silver. The story of the Varangians begins not with warriors, but with merchants, not with axes, but with amber. Long before any Norseman swore an oath to a Byzantine emperor, the men of Scandinavia had discovered something remarkable. The great rivers of what we now call Russia and Ukraine, rivers with names that would become legendary, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don. These waterways formed a highway from the cold northern seas all the way to the warm waters of the Mediterranean and beyond. Picture the geography of it. From the Baltic Sea, a determined traveller could navigate inland, moving up rivers that wound through endless forests of pine and birch. At certain points, where the rivers came tantalizingly close to one another, a crew could drag their boats overland, carrying them across the portages until they reached the next waterway. It was exhausting work, dangerous work, but it was possible. And for those willing to make the journey, the rewards were beyond imagination. By the middle of the 9th century after Christ, Norse traders had established a regular route from Scandinavia to the Black Sea. They would load their shallow-drafted boats with furs from the northern forests, amber from the Baltic shores, slaves taken in raids, and walrus ivory from the Arctic. Then they would begin the long journey south, moving through lands inhabited by Slavic tribes, Finno-Ugric peoples, and the remnants of earlier empires. At each stopping point, they might trade, they might raid, they might simply pass through depending on local strength and local hospitality. The Slavic peoples they encountered called these Norse traders and warriors the Rus, a name whose origin remains debated by scholars, but which would eventually give its name to an entire region and later to the largest country in the world. Some of these Norsemen settled along the river routes, establishing trading posts that would grow into cities. Novgorod in the north, Kiev further south. These places became Norse-Slavic hybrids, ruled by Scandinavian princes who married into Slavic nobility and gradually adopted local customs while maintaining connections to their homeland. But the ultimate destination, The prize that made all the danger worthwhile lay at the southern terminus of these river roads. There, where the great rivers emptied into the Black Sea, across that dark water lay the richest, most powerful, most sophisticated civilization in the known world. The Eastern Roman Empire, which history would later call the Byzantine Empire, had its capital at Constantinople. The Norse called it Miklagard. The Slavs called it Tsargrad, the city of the emperor. By any name, it represented something that must have seemed almost mythical to men from the north. Imagine what Byzantine wealth meant to a Scandinavian trader in the year 900 after Christ. In the north, wealth meant silver arm rings, a good sword passed down through generations, perhaps some jewellery of decent craftsmanship. But in Constantinople, there was gold everywhere. Not just gold jewellery, but golden mosaics covering entire church walls, golden vessels for religious ceremonies, golden coins that flowed through the markets in quantities that seemed impossible. There were silks that shimmered with colours the North had never seen, spices whose scents were intoxicating, jewels whose names the Norse didn't even know. The Byzantine Greeks were sophisticated traders. They knew how to extract maximum value from the hungry merchants who arrived from the north, but they also recognized the quality of what those merchants brought. Northern furs, especially sable and ermine, were prized by Byzantine aristocrats. Amber had been treasured since ancient times. Scandinavian metalwork, particularly weapons, had a reputation for quality, and there was always a market for slaves, though this was perhaps the darkest element of the northern trade. So a pattern established itself over the course of the 9th and early 10th centuries after Christ. Each summer, when the rivers were navigable and the weather relatively mild, flotillas of Norse boats would make the journey south. They would trade, they would spend time in Constantinople, marvelling at its wonders, and then they would return north, laden with goods that would make them wealthy men by northern standards. Some would return year after year. Others would make only one journey in their lives, but that single journey would be enough to secure their fortune and their reputation. These merchants were not warriors by primary profession, though any man who travelled such dangerous routes had to be capable with weapons. But through their journeys, they brought back to Scandinavia stories of Byzantine wealth and power that must have seemed scarcely believable. And among those listening to these stories were young men with more interest in axes than in trading goods, men who wondered if there might be another way to win Byzantine gold. The first axes in the south, the Byzantine Empire, in the 10th century after Christ, was a paradox of strength and fragility. On paper, it was the mightiest state in Christendom, the direct continuation of the Roman Empire that had once ruled the entire Mediterranean world. Constantinople was the largest, wealthiest, most cultured city west of China. Byzantine learning, Byzantine art, Byzantine engineering were without peer in Europe. The empire's army, when properly funded and competently led, could field forces that dazzled with their discipline and tactical sophistication. But the empire faced threats from every direction. To the east, Arab caliphates and later Seljuk Turks pressed against Byzantine borders in Asia Minor. To the north, Bulgarian Khans built their own powerful state and dreamed of capturing Constantinople itself. To the west, ambitious powers in Italy eyed Byzantine territories, and perhaps most dangerous of all, internal politics in Constantinople were a constant swirl of conspiracy, assassination, and civil war. Byzantine emperors ruled absolutely, but they also lived with the knowledge that they might be deposed, blinded, or murdered at any moment. This combination created a peculiar problem. Byzantine emperors needed loyal soldiers, truly loyal soldiers, men who would defend them not out of political calculation but out of genuine commitment. The problem was that native Byzantine troops came with political connections. A Byzantine general might be competent, but he might also be ambitious. A Byzantine regiment might fight well, but its soldiers might also be susceptible to bribes or persuasion from a would-be usurper. Every emperor knew the history of Rome, knew how many emperors had been made or unmade by the army. The solution, practiced on and off for centuries, was to hire foreign soldiers, barbarians, from the Byzantine perspective, though that term carried less contempt than it might suggest. Foreign soldiers had no stake in Byzantine politics. They couldn't easily be turned by conspirators because they didn't speak Greek fluently, didn't understand the subtle games of the court, and had no family connections to exploit. If they were paid well and treated well, they would fight with ferocity and absolute loyalty. And if an emperor needed to suppress a revolt by native troops or aristocrats, foreign soldiers would do so without hesitation or regret. By the middle of the 10th century after Christ, Byzantine emperors had discovered the Norse. These were not the merchant traders of the river routes, though the line between merchant and warrior was always blurry among the Scandinavians. These were younger sons, landless men, those who had killed someone and needed to leave their homeland, or simply ambitious warriors who had heard stories of Byzantine wealth and wanted to win it with their axes rather than through trade. The first Norse warriors to serve Byzantine emperors did so as individuals or small bands, hired through intermediaries, probably recruited in the trading posts along the river routes. They would have been exotic figures in Constantinople, tall men with light hair and light eyes, speaking a language that sounded harsh to Greek ears, carrying distinctive, long-handled axes that they wielded with terrifying skill. Byzantine chroniclers, when they mentioned these early northern mercenaries at all, seemed both impressed by their fighting ability and slightly bemused by their barbaric customs. But these early Norse mercenaries proved their worth. They fought in campaigns against the Arabs in the east and the Bulgarians in the north. They served as bodyguards for generals and even for emperors themselves, and most importantly, they proved to be reliable. Unlike Byzantine soldiers who might be tempted by political intrigue, these northerners seemed to care only about their pay and their honour. Tell them to hold a position, and they would die on that spot rather than retreat. Tell them to guard an emperor, and they would kill anyone who tried to approach him without permission. Word of this spread along the river routes, carried by merchants and by warriors returning north with heavy purses. In Scandinavia, in Kiev, in Novgorod, young men began to dream not just of trading with Byzantium but of serving its emperor. The Greeks had a name for these northern warriors. They called them Varangians, a word whose origin scholars still debate, but which probably derived from Old Norse, meaning something like sworn companions or oathmen. It was a fitting name, for the oath they took would become the foundation of one of history's most famous military units. By the year 980 after Christ, Norse warriors were established as a recognized presence in Byzantine military service. But they were still individuals, still small bands hired on temporary contracts. What would transform them into something legendary, what would create the famous Varangian Guard, required a crisis in the north, an ambitious emperor in the south, and a bargain that would change the course of two civilizations. You stand at the Dnieper rapids. You are on a river in the spring of 988 after Christ, and you are about to discover what fear really means. The boat rocks beneath your feet, a simple clinker-built vessel that has carried you and 15 other men from Kiev for the past week. Your hands are rough from rowing, your back aches from sleeping on hard ground, but none of that matters now. What matters are the rapids ahead and the sound they make. You can hear them before you see them. It starts as a distant murmur, like wind through trees, but as you round a bend in the river, the murmur becomes a roar. White water crashes over black rocks that jut up from the river like the teeth of some ancient beast. The current moves faster here, pulling at your boat with strength you cannot fight. Your captain, a man from Gotland who has made this journey 3 times before, is shouting orders. His voice barely carries over the thunder of water. This is the 5th of the 7 cataracts, the 5th place where the Dnieper becomes impassable to boats. The locals, The Slavic and Turkic peoples who live along these banks have names for each rapid. This one they call Vulniprag, the wave rapid, and you understand why. The waves don't move like ocean waves, orderly and predictable. They explode upward, unpredictable and violent, as the river fights with the stone that tries to contain it. You and your companions begin the portage. The boat must be unloaded completely, every piece of cargo carried inland around the rapids to calm water downstream. Then the boat itself must be lifted, carried on the shoulders of men straining with the weight. You taste sweat and river water. Your boots sink into mud that sucks at each step. The forest presses close on either side, dark with pines that have stood here since before your grandfather's time. This is when you are most vulnerable. Your captain has posted guards, men with spears and axes watching the tree line, because the Pechenegs know about the portages. These Turkic nomads raid the river routes, waiting for moments exactly like this, when Norse traders and warriors are burdened with boats and cargo, unable to fight effectively. You've heard stories of entire crews slaughtered at the portages, their goods taken, their bodies left for the wolves. But today, you see no Pechenegs. You hear only the river and the grunting of men as they lift and carry. Your shoulder burns where the boat's weight presses against it. You can smell the pine resin and the earth, rich and damp. Somewhere overhead, a bird calls, sharp and clear, above the water's roar. When the boat is finally back in the water, downstream from the rapids, when you have reloaded the cargo and pushed off again into the current, you allow yourself to breathe deeply. 2 more cataracts remain between you and the Black Sea. 2 more chances to be drowned or killed. But you are young, and you have chosen this. You have left behind a farm in Sweden, where you would have spent your life cutting hay and mending fences. Your older brother will inherit that farm. For you, there is only this: the river, the danger, and at the end of it, if you survive, a city of gold. You think about what the merchants have told you, the ones who have been to Miklagard. They speak of buildings that rise higher than any tree, walls so thick that siege engines break against them like waves against cliffs. They speak of markets where you can buy silks from China, jewels from India, spices whose names you cannot pronounce. They speak of churches where the walls themselves seem to be made of light, where gold and coloured stone create images of saints who look down with eyes that follow you. You wonder if you will see these things. You wonder if you will survive to swing your axe in the emperor's service. You wonder what it will feel like to stand in the great palace, to take the oath that will transform you from a farmer's son into something else entirely, something grander and stranger than anything your ancestors could have imagined. The sun is lowering now, painting the water with copper light. The river widens as it moves south, becoming slower, more manageable. You will make camp soon, on some low island or protected bank, and you will eat salted fish and hard bread, and you will check your weapons, and you will try to sleep despite the ache in your muscles and the excitement in your chest. Tomorrow, you will continue south, and with each passing day, you move closer to a city where emperors wear purple, where philosophers debate in Greek, where your axe will be worth more than gold, because it comes with your loyalty, your strength, and your willingness to die for a man you have never met, in a cause you may not fully understand, for the simple reason that you have sworn an oath, and a Norse oath is more sacred than life itself. Basil the Volga slayer's need. In the year 988, after the birth of Christ, the Byzantine Emperor Basil II faced a crisis that threatened to destroy everything his family had built. Basil had become emperor in 976, but for the first 13 years of his reign, he had been emperor in name only. The real power lay with the Parakoimomenos, the chief chamberlain, an elderly eunuch named Basil Lekapinos, who had served Basil's father. This arrangement was not uncommon in Byzantium, where a young emperor might rule under the guidance of a regent until he came of age. But Basil II was not content with this arrangement, and in 985, when he was nearly 30 years old, he finally moved against his namesake regent. Basil Lecapenus was arrested, his vast wealth confiscated, and sent to a monastery. The young emperor would rule alone. But ruling Byzantium was vastly different from merely occupying the throne. Basil quickly discovered that his empire was beset by threats both external and internal. The Bulgarians, under their Tsar Samuel, had been expanding their territory, pushing into Byzantine lands in the Balkans. In the east, Arab emirates continued their endless pressure on the empire's Asian borders, and perhaps most dangerously, within the empire itself, powerful aristocratic families commanded vast estates and private armies, and they resented any emperor who tried to constrain their power. The most immediate threat came from within. In 987, 1 year after Basil took full control of the empire, a general named Bardas Phocas rebelled. This was no minor provincial revolt. Bardas Phocas came from one of the most powerful families in the empire, a family that had produced generals and emperors. He commanded the loyalty of significant portions of the Byzantine army, particularly the forces in Asia Minor. He was a competent military commander, and he had the support of other aristocratic families who saw in him a potential emperor who would be more amenable to their interests than the stubborn young Basil. Within months, Bardas Phocas controlled much of Asia Minor. He struck coins with his own image. Declaring himself emperor, his forces won several engagements against troops loyal to Basil. Constantinople itself was not immediately threatened, but everyone knew that if Bardas could consolidate his position in Asia and then cross into Europe, the capital would be at risk. Civil wars in Byzantium often ended with sieges of Constantinople, and sieges often ended with open gates and a change of dynasty. Basil needed soldiers. That was the simple, terrible reality. He needed soldiers who were loyal to him personally, who could not be turned by Bardas Phocas's promises or bribes, who would fight with absolute commitment. The problem was that much of the Byzantine army was already committed on various fronts, and the portions of it that remained available were of questionable loyalty. Byzantine politics infected everything. A regiment's commander might be someone's brother-in-law, or someone's debtor, or someone with ambitions of his own. What Basil needed was what Byzantine emperors had often needed in times of crisis: foreign soldiers with no stake in Byzantine politics and no reason to care about aristocratic factions. He needed warriors who would fight because they were paid to fight and because they had sworn an oath. He needed barbarians who cared nothing for the subtle intrigues of the court and everything for gold and glory. Basil sent envoys north. They travelled the river routes that Norse merchants had been using for more than a century, moving through the trading posts and Norse Slavic cities that dotted the waterways. They carried messages for Vladimir, the Prince of Kiev. Vladimir was himself of Scandinavian descent. His grandmother, Olga, had been a princess of Kiev, but his grandfather, Sviatoslav, bore a clearly Slavic name, and the dynasty that ruled from Kiev represented a fusion of Norse and Slavic elements. Vladimir had only recently secured his position as Prince of Kiev, having fought a civil war against his brother. He understood power, he understood the usefulness of warrior followers, and he understood that the Byzantine emperor's need represented an opportunity. Basil's envoys came with an offer. The emperor needed warriors, specifically Norse warriors, known for their size, strength, and fighting ability. If Vladimir could provide such warriors in significant numbers, Basil would pay handsomely. More than that, Basil was willing to offer something almost unprecedented. He would allow Vladimir to marry his sister Anna, a Byzantine princess of the imperial family. Such marriages were vanishingly rare. Byzantine emperors did not give their sisters to foreign princes. The marriage would elevate Vladimir's status immensely, would make him a brother-in-law to the Roman emperor himself. But there was a condition, a non-negotiable condition. Vladimir would have to convert to Christianity, specifically to Orthodox Christianity, as practiced in Constantinople. More than that, He would have to make Christianity the official religion of his realm, would have to order the conversion of his people. The Byzantine Empire was not merely a political entity, but a religious one. Its emperors saw themselves as God's chosen instruments, defenders of the true faith. They could not give an imperial princess to a pagan, could not ally themselves through marriage with a ruler who still sacrificed to the old gods. Vladimir considered the offer. He had his own reasons for wanting a closer relationship with Byzantium, reasons that had little to do with Basil's immediate military needs. A marriage alliance with Constantinople would give Kiev enormous prestige. Conversion to Christianity would connect his realm to the broader Christian world, would bring Byzantine priests and teachers who could help develop a more sophisticated court culture. And practically speaking, Vladimir had warriors to spare. There were always young men willing to go south to win glory and wealth. Providing them to Basil would cost Vladimir little, while potentially gaining him much. And so, in the winter of 987 to 988, Vladimir gathered his warriors. The number given by Byzantine sources would be 6,000 men, though whether this was an exact count or a round number meant to suggest a large force is unclear. These would not be Slavic warriors from Kiev's own population, but Norse warriors, men from Scandinavia and from the Norse Slavic settlements. Along the river routes, men who had come to Kiev specifically because it was a place where warriors could find employment. The bargain was struck. Vladimir would convert and provide warriors. Basil would provide gold and a bride, and 6,000 Norse warriors would march south to save a Byzantine emperor from a rebel who threatened his throne. None of them could have known that they were about to become the foundation of a military unit that would guard Byzantine emperors for the next 3 centuries. The bargain of Kiev, the conversion of Vladimir and the Kievan realm to Christianity in 988, after Christ, was one of those historical moments that changed the trajectory of an entire civilization. It was also, from Vladimir's perspective, a remarkably practical decision dressed in the language of spiritual revelation. Vladimir had inherited a realm that still largely worshipped the old Slavic gods, deities of thunder and harvest, of forest and river. The Norse elite, who had settled in Kiev generations earlier, had brought their own gods, Odin and Thor and Freya, and these had blended with Slavic beliefs to create a complex pagan landscape. Vladimir himself had initially been a devoted pagan, even erecting a new temple to the gods and demanding human sacrifices in their honor. But Vladimir was also an ambitious ruler who understood that religious choice had political implications. He looked around at his neighbors and rivals, and he saw that all the major powers had adopted one or another of the great monotheistic faiths. The Byzantines were Orthodox Christians. The Germans and other Western Europeans were Catholic Christians, acknowledging the Pope in Rome. The Volga Bulgars to the east had adopted Islam. The Khazars had converted to Judaism. Each of these faiths connected those who practiced it to larger networks of trade, culture, and military alliance. For a prince of Kiev, sitting at the crossroads of these civilizations, religious conversion was not merely about personal belief. It was about choosing which civilization to align with, which cultural and political network to join, and the Byzantine connection offered the most. Byzantium was rich, sophisticated, and powerful. Its trade goods were superior to anything available in the north or west. Its culture, from its literature to its art to its architecture, was unmatched. And now Basil was offering not just an alliance, but a marriage, a connection by blood to the imperial family itself. The story, as later chroniclers would tell it, involved Vladimir sending envoys to investigate the various faiths before making his decision. These envoys supposedly rejected Islam because it forbade alcohol, Judaism because the Jewish people had lost their homeland, suggesting God's disfavor, and Western Christianity because its services seemed plain and joyless. But when they attended a service at Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they reported that they could not tell whether they were in heaven or on earth. So beautiful was the liturgy, so magnificent was the architecture, so overwhelming was the experience. Whether this story is literally true, or a later elaboration designed to explain Vladimir's choice, the essential point is clear. Vladimir chose Byzantine orthodoxy because it offered the best combination of spiritual grandeur and practical advantage. And having made that choice, he implemented it with the decisive brutality that characterized many medieval conversions. The great statue of Perun, the Slavic thunder god that Vladimir had himself erected, was tied to a horse's tail and dragged through Kiev before being thrown into the Dnieper river. Other pagan idols received similar treatment. The population of Kiev was ordered to gather at the river, and priests brought from Constantinople performed mass baptisms. The chroniclers claim that Vladimir himself was baptized first, taking the Christian name Basil in honor of his future brother-in-law, the emperor. This was not a gentle, gradual conversion, but a commanded transformation imposed from above. Yet it also was not entirely forced. Many in Kiev's elite had been trading with Byzantium for generations and had seen the power and wealth that Christianity seemed to bring. Adopting the religion of your trading partners made practical sense. And for the common people, religious practice was often more about community ritual than deep theological understanding. If the prince said to worship the Christian god instead of the old gods, most people would comply, at least outwardly. What mattered for Basil's immediate purposes was that Vladimir kept his end of the bargain. The 6,000 warriors were assembled. These were not the merchants who carefully portaged their boats around the Dnieper cataracts. These were fighters, men who carried axes and swords, who wore whatever armor they could afford, who knew that they were marching south to war. Some came from Scandinavia itself, younger sons with no inheritance, troublemakers fleeing blood feuds, ambitious warriors seeking glory. Others came from the Norse Slavic settlements, men who might have Slavic mothers but Norse fathers, who spoke both languages and moved easily between both worlds. They travelled in groups and bands, converging on Kiev and then moving south along the river routes. The journey took weeks, through the same dangerous territories that merchants navigated, past the same cataracts that claimed boats and lives every year. But they came in sufficient numbers that raiders thought twice about attacking them, and they had Vladimir's promise of Byzantine gold waiting at the end of their journey. By the spring of 988, they were arriving in Constantinople. 6,000 Norse warriors, the largest force of northern mercenaries the Byzantines had ever hired at one time. They must have been an impressive sight. These tall men with their long hair and beards, their distinctive axes and round shields, speaking a language that sounded like nothing the Greeks had heard before. Basil received them with both relief and calculation. Here were warriors who owed nothing to Barda's focus, who had no connection to Byzantine aristocratic families, who could not be bribed or persuaded by promises of land or titles, because they didn't want Byzantine land or titles. They wanted gold, and Basil had gold. They wanted glory, and Basil could give them battles to fight. And they came with something else, something that Basil would discover was perhaps their most valuable quality. They were oath-bound. Once they swore an oath to serve the emperor, they would serve unto death. Their honour demanded it, and for men from the north, honour was more binding than any contract. Vladimir got his bride. Anna arrived in Kiev, surely with mixed feelings about being married to a former pagan prince, in a city that must have seemed crude and cold compared to Constantinople. But she came with priests and books, with icons and liturgical items, with all the apparatus of Byzantine Christianity. Under her influence, and that of the priests who followed her, Kiev would begin its transformation into an Orthodox Christian realm, a process that would take generations, but which would ultimately create a new civilization, one that would endure for 1,000 years. And in Constantinople, Basil had his army, 6,000 Norse axes, and behind them the implied promise that more could come if needed, a pipeline of warriors from the north who would fight for gold and glory. Now all that remained was to see if they could fight, as well as their reputation suggested. The forging of the Guard, the transformation of 6,000 Norse mercenaries into the Varangian Guard, was not instantaneous. It was a process that occurred over several years, shaped by battlefield success, imperial trust, and the gradual development of institutional structures that would define the Guard for the next 3 centuries. Initially, these warriors were simply foreign mercenaries, soldiers hired for a specific crisis. They were organized according to their own customs, led by their own chieftains and oath leaders. Byzantine commanders must have found them challenging to work with. They did not speak Greek. They did not understand Byzantine military terminology or standard Byzantine tactics. They had their own ideas about how warfare should be conducted, ideas formed in the very different context of Scandinavian raiding and small-scale warfare. But Basil II was not a man to be deterred by language barriers or cultural differences. He was fundamentally a soldier, emperor, more comfortable on campaign than in the palace, more interested in military effectiveness than in cultural purity. If these northerners could fight, he would use them, and he would use them in the way that would be most valuable, as his personal troops, soldiers who answered directly to him, rather than to Byzantine generals who might have divided loyalties. The Byzantine military system of this period was complex. There were the thematic armies, soldiers drawn from military districts who farmed when not campaigning. There were the tagmata, professional regiments based in and around Constantinople. There were foreign mercenaries of various types. And there was the emperor's personal guard, a unit that had gone by various names over the centuries, but whose function was always the same: to protect the emperor's person and to serve as his most reliable military force in moments of crisis. What Basil did, probably over the course of 988 and 89, was to reorganize his Norse mercenaries into a new imperial guard unit. They would be called the Varangian Guard, taking the name from the Greek term for these Norse warriors. They would be quartered in or near the Great Palace in Constantinople. They would receive superior pay, higher than any Byzantine unit. And most importantly, they would take an oath directly to the emperor, an oath that bound them to protect his life and serve his interests above all others. The oath was crucial. In Byzantine culture, oaths were serious matters, sworn on holy relics and invoking divine punishment for oath breakers. But for the Norse warriors, oaths carried even more weight. In Scandinavian culture, a man's honour was his most precious possession, and honour was defined largely by oath-keeping. A man who broke his oath was nithingr, a term that meant something close to shameful wretch, someone who had forfeited all claim to respect or trust. Such a person might as well be dead, for no one would deal with him, no one would fight beside him, no one would even shelter him. This cultural value made the Varangians extraordinarily reliable once they had sworn their oath. A Byzantine soldier might calculate whether betraying the emperor could lead to greater rewards. A Varangian simply wouldn't consider it. He had sworn an oath. That was the end of calculation. This reliability was exactly what Basil needed, and it would become the foundation of the Varangian Guard's reputation for centuries to come. The Guard was organised along lines that combined Byzantine and Norse elements. The overall commander was called the Akaluthos, a Greek title meaning follower or attendant. This was a Byzantine official, usually someone with court connections and military experience, someone who could serve as an intermediary between the emperor and his foreign guardsmen. But within the Guard itself, leadership positions went to Norse chieftains, men who had commanded warriors before coming south, men who spoke the northern languages and understood the culture from which the guardsmen came. Pay was generous, far more generous than what native Byzantine troops received. A Varangian guardsman could expect regular wages in gold coin, the famous numismata that maintained their value and purity for centuries. Beyond regular pay, There were bonuses for specific campaigns, rewards for faithful service, and most spectacularly, there was what the sources call the palace plundering privilege. This privilege, which we'll explore more fully later, essentially gave the Varangian guard the right to take certain valuables from the palace when an emperor died. The guardsmen could enter the imperial chambers and claim gold and gems and precious objects, a practice that must have seemed bizarre to Byzantine Greeks, but which fit Norse customs of funeral goods and inheritance. This privilege could make a guardsman wealthy beyond anything he could have achieved in a lifetime of farming or trading in Scandinavia. The guards' duties were both ceremonial and practical. In times of peace, they served as the emperor's bodyguards, standing watch in the great palace, accompanying the emperor to public appearances and religious services. They would stand at attention during audiences and councils, silent and intimidating, their great axes resting on their shoulders, visual symbols of the emperor's power and security. Foreign ambassadors and Byzantine nobles alike would have to pass by these towering, fair-haired warriors to approach the emperor, a reminder that challenging imperial authority meant facing men who had no reason to hesitate and every reason to be loyal. In times of war, the guard accompanied the emperor on campaign. Byzantine emperors in this period often led their armies personally, and the Varangian guard served as the core of the imperial division, the most reliable troops who could be counted on to hold a position, to make a desperate charge, or to protect the emperor if battle turned against Byzantine forces. They were shock troops, warriors who could break enemy formations through sheer ferocity and physical strength. Their signature weapon was the long-hafted axe, a two-handed weapon that the Greeks called a pelikis. Byzantine soldiers typically fought with swords and spears, wearing relatively light armor to maintain mobility. The Varangians fought differently. They wore heavier armor when they could afford it, mail shirts of good quality, helmets, and they wielded their axes with devastating effect. A skilled axeman could split shields, smash through armor, and kill with a single blow. In close combat, they were terrifying, but they were more than just effective fighters. They were symbols. The very presence of the Varangian guard told everyone who saw them that the emperor commanded the loyalty of warriors from the distant north, that his power and wealth were such that men would travel thousands of miles to serve him. They embodied the cosmopolitan nature of the Byzantine Empire, the way it could draw strength from peoples across the known world, and they represented something that Byzantine politics often lacked: uncomplicated, uncorrupted loyalty. By the end of 988, the Varangian Guard existed as an institution. 6,000 warriors had become an organized military unit with defined duties, regular pay, and a special relationship with the emperor. They had taken their oaths, they had been equipped and quartered, and now they waited for the moment when they would prove their worth. That moment would come soon, on a battlefield where the fate of Basil's throne would be decided. Bjorn's journey. His name was Bjorn, and he left the farm on a morning when frost still clung to the grass. His mother stood in the doorway and did not cry, because women of her generation did not cry where others could see. His father walked with him to the road and gave him a sword that had belonged to Bjorn's grandfather. It was not a great sword, not one of the pattern-welded blades with names and reputations, but it was solid and well-maintained, and it had kept a man alive through 2 raiding seasons. There would have to be enough. Bjorn's older brother stayed at the farm. Someone had to stay. Someone had to inherit the 3 fields, and the cattle and the debts. That someone was Hallgrim, who was stronger than Bjorn and smarter than Bjorn, and who would probably make a success of the farm in ways their father never had. But Bjorn had something Hallgrim lacked, a restlessness that made the farm feel like a cage, and every winter like an eternity. The decision to go south had not been difficult. A merchant had come through the district the previous summer, a man who had been to Miklagard and who told stories in the Earl's Hall. He spoke of a city where the buildings reached higher than the tallest pine. where water flowed through pipes into fountains in every square, where churches gleamed with gold that covered entire walls. He spoke of an emperor who paid his guards in gold coins, not silver, and who allowed them privileges that seemed impossible. And he spoke of battles against enemies with strange names, of glory to be won in the service of the greatest ruler in the world. Bjorn had listened, and Bjorn had decided. He was 18 years old. If he stayed, he would spend his life on someone else's farm, probably marrying a local girl whose dowry was a few cows, raising children who would themselves face lives of grinding work and limited prospects. Or he could go south. He could risk everything for the chance at something more. The journey to Kiev took weeks. He travelled with 2 other men from his district, and they joined a larger group at the coast. 20 warriors in total, all heading east and then south along the trade routes. Some of these men were fleeing blood feuds, justice for killings that might have been justified or might not. Others were like Bjorn, simply seeking something their homeland couldn't provide. They told stories as they walked and sailed and portaged. They shared food and kept watch, and gradually became a band, men who might not be friends, but who would fight beside each other if necessary. Kiev impressed Bjorn. It was larger than any settlement he had seen, with wooden buildings that seemed almost Byzantine in their ambition, rising 2 stories and even 3. The market sold goods from everywhere, furs from the far north, silks from the far east, weapons and jewellery and slaves. The prince's hall was a proper palace, or at least it seemed so to Bjorn, who had never seen a palace before. And everywhere there were warriors, men from Scandinavia and from the Slavic tribes, all gathered because Kiev was where warriors went when they wanted employment. They waited in Kiev for 3 weeks until enough men had gathered to form a proper company. Vladimir's officials organised them, took their names, assigned them to groups. There was a priest who insisted that Bjorn be baptised before he could travel further south. A quick and perfunctory ceremony that involved cold water and words in a language Bjorn didn't understand. He was now Christian, apparently, though he still wore Thor's hammer around his neck, alongside the cross they gave him. The gods would understand, he thought. This was about practical matters, not belief. The journey south from Kiev was harder than anything Bjorn had experienced before. The river was swollen with spring runoff, the current treacherous. At the cataracts, they hauled boats and cargo through mud and over rocks, while scouts watched for Pecheneg raiders. Men fell sick from bad water or spoiled food. One man, a youth even younger than Bjorn, drowned when he lost his footing during a portage and was swept downstream. They didn't recover his body, but Bjorn survived, and the company survived, and eventually the Dnieper widened and calmed, and they could see the Black Sea ahead, dark water, stretching to a horizon that seemed impossibly distant. They followed the coast west, staying close to shore, camping on beaches where they could watch both the sea and the land for threats. And then, after what felt like an endless series of identical days, someone shouted and pointed, and there it was, Constantinople, Miklagard, the great city. Even from a distance, it was overwhelming. The walls stretched for miles, massive triple fortifications that seemed impossible, walls that no army could possibly breach. The city rose behind those walls in layers, building upon building, crowned by domes that caught the sunlight and seemed to glow. Bjorn had thought Kiev was impressive. Kiev was a village compared to this. They entered through a sea gate, passing under archways carved with Greek letters that Bjorn couldn't read. The streets were paved, with stones fitted so precisely that the surface was almost smooth. And the people, thousands of people, tens of thousands, moving through markets and around fountains, speaking Greek and Arabic and Armenian and languages Bjorn had never heard. The noise was incredible, a constant background roar of voices and wheels and hammers and bells. They were quartered in a barracks near the palace, a stone building that seemed palatial itself by northern standards. They were fed, bread that was actually white, and meat that wasn't salted or dried. They were given a small advance on their pay, actual gold coins with an emperor's face on them. And then they were told to wait, because the emperor was organizing his campaign against the rebel Bardas Phocas, and they would march when he was ready. Bjorn spent those weeks in a daze. He walked through the city when he was allowed, staring at everything, understanding nothing. He attended an Orthodox service in a small church and could not comprehend how anyone could have built such a space, how the dome seemed to float unsupported, how the light transformed simple, painted images into something that seemed alive. He tried to learn Greek words and mangled most of them. He practiced with his sword and his axe in the barracks yard and felt utterly inadequate compared to Byzantine soldiers who trained with a precision that seemed almost supernatural. But he was here. He had made the journey that most men in his village would never even attempt. He wore a mail shirt now, bought with his advance pay from a craftsman who sold military equipment. He carried his grandfather's sword and an axe he'd been issued, a good solid weapon with a long haft. And soon, he would march with the emperor's army. He would fight in battles that would be remembered in sagas. He might die, probably would die, if the stories about how dangerous warfare could be were true. But if he lived, if he served faithfully and fought well and survived long enough to complete his service, he would return to Scandinavia wealthy. He would build his own farm, not a marginal plot carved out of forest, but something substantial. He would marry well. His children would have full bellies and warm clothes, and maybe one of them would tell stories about their father who went to Miklagard and served the Roman emperor and came home with gold. That would be enough. That would be everything. First blood. The Battle of Abydos. The test of the Varangian Guard came in the spring of 989 after Christ, at a place called Abydos, on the Asian shore of the Hellespont, the narrow strait that separates Europe from Asia. It would be a battle that determined not only the fate of Basil's throne, but also the reputation of his Norse guardsmen. Bardas Phocas had spent the winter consolidating his control over Asia Minor. He had secured the support of most of the region's aristocracy, men who saw in him a more pliant emperor than the stern and uncompromising Basil. He had gathered an army that Byzantine sources numbered at over 30,000 men, though such numbers are always suspect, and probably included non-combatants and camp followers as well as actual warriors. What mattered was that his force was substantial, experienced, and loyal to him personally. Basil's strategy was to prevent Bardas from crossing into Europe. If the rebel reached Thrace and approached Constantinople, the situation would become extremely dangerous. Byzantine civil wars often hinged on control of the capital, and even strong emperors could find their support evaporating if a usurper approached the gates with a victorious army. Basil needed to defeat Bardas decisively, to break his army and his claim to the throne before the rebellion spread further. The emperor gathered his forces near Constantinople and prepared to cross the Hellespont himself to bring the battle to Asia Minor before Bardas could bring it to Europe. This required confidence, the willingness to risk an imperial army and the emperor's own person on a single engagement. But Basil was not a man to sit behind walls hoping someone else would solve his problems. He would lead his army personally, and at its core would be his new Varangian Guard. The crossing was made in early April. Byzantine ships carried the army across the strait, landing on the Asian shore near Abydos. The logistics must have been complex, moving thousands of men and horses and supplies across water, establishing a beachhead, preparing for battle in potentially hostile territory. Byzantine commanders had experience with such operations, but it was still the kind of maneuver where much could go wrong. Bardas Phocas marched to meet them. The sources suggest he was confident, perhaps overconfident. He commanded more men than Basil, and those men included many of the best troops from the Asian themes. Soldiers who had been fighting against Arab raiders and Armenian rebels for years. Against them, Basil had assembled a mixed force, some Byzantine regiments of uncertain loyalty, cavalry units, and most notably, his 6,000 Norse mercenaries who had never fought in a proper set-piece battle for the empire. The armies met on a plain near Abydos on April 13th, 989. The exact details of the battle are difficult to reconstruct because our sources are limited and often contradictory. Byzantine chroniclers wrote years or decades later, and they were more interested in praising Basil and condemning Bardas than in providing tactical analyses. But the broad outlines are clear enough. Basil positioned his army with the Varangians at the centre. This was where the critical fighting would occur, where Bardas would likely direct his main assault. The Varangian Guard would have to prove themselves here, would have to hold their ground against battle-hardened Byzantine soldiers who fought for a man they believed should be emperor. The battle began with archery and skirmishing, the usual prelude to medieval combat. Light infantry and horse archers from both sides exchanged volleys, trying to disorder enemy formations before the main engagement. Then came the moment when the armies closed, when the careful planning and positioning gave way to the chaos of hand-to-hand combat. The Varangians fought on foot, as was their custom. They formed a shield wall, a tactic the Norse had been using for centuries, where warriors stood shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping, creating a barrier that was difficult to break. Behind their shields, they held their long axes, weapons that could reach over the shield wall to strike at enemies, or could be used from the second rank to smash down on anyone who approached. Bardas's forces crashed into this shield wall with a force of professional soldiers who believed they were fighting for the rightful emperor. The noise must have been indescribable. The clang of weapons on shields and armour, the shouting of men trying to encourage their comrades or frighten their enemies, the screams of wounded and dying. Combat at close quarters was exhausting, terrifying, and utterly chaotic. Men fought and died in a space of a few square feet, unable to see the larger battle, knowing only what was directly in front of them. The Varangians held. This is the essential fact that emerges from all the confused accounts. They held their position, their shield wall intact, their axes rising and falling with mechanical regularity. Byzantine soldiers who charged that wall found themselves facing warriors who were physically larger and stronger than most Greeks, men who wielded weapons that could split shields and break bones, men who had sworn oaths and who would rather die than retreat. Hours passed. Medieval battles were not quick affairs but grinding tests of endurance. The Varangians rotated men from the front rank to the rear and back again, keeping fresh warriors in the fight. They drank from waterskins when they could. They stepped over the bodies of the fallen, both their own dead and enemy dead, and continued fighting. The turning point came when Bardas Phocas himself led a cavalry charge against the Byzantine left flank. This was the kind of dramatic gesture that could win battles, a leader putting himself at risk to inspire his men. But it was also extraordinarily dangerous, and on this day, it proved fatal. Bardas was either struck by an arrow or suffered a stroke. The sources disagree. Either way, he fell from his horse in sight of both armies. The death of a commander in the midst of battle can cause immediate collapse, especially in medieval warfare, where leadership was personal and visible. Bardas's army, seeing their would-be emperor fall, began to waver. Some units continued fighting, but others broke and fled. What had been a desperate contest became a rout. The Varangians pursued. This was the dangerous part, when a disciplined formation broke up to chase fleeing enemies, when warriors became vulnerable to ambush or counterattack. But there was no counterattack. Bardas's army was disintegrating, men throwing down weapons and running for their lives. The Varangians cut down those they could catch, took prisoners when possible, and captured Bardas's camp with all its supplies and treasure. By nightfall, the rebellion was over. Bardas Phocas was dead, his army scattered, his claim to the throne extinguished. Basil's throne was secure, and the Varangian Guard had proved that they were worth every nomisma of their generous pay. They had held the line when the battle balanced on the edge of disaster. They had fought with discipline and ferocity, and they had given Basil exactly what he needed, an absolutely reliable corps of soldiers who would not break, would not betray, would not fail. In the aftermath, as the army returned to Constantinople and victory was celebrated, the reputation of the Varangian Guard was established. They were no longer just foreign mercenaries. They were the emperor's personal troops, the elite guardsmen who had saved the empire in its moment of crisis. For the next 3 centuries, that reputation would be the foundation of their identity and their power. The weight of gold. After Abydos, there was gold. So much gold that warriors who had grown up in small villages, who had never owned more than a few silver arm rings, found themselves wealthy beyond anything they had imagined. The immediate payment came from Bardas Foka's captured camp, a rebel's treasury, coins and plate and jewellery, and all the portable wealth that an ambitious usurper had accumulated to pay his troops and maintain his court. By the customs of war, this belonged to the victors, and Basil was generous in distributing it. The Varangian Guard, which had held the centre of the line and borne the brunt of the fighting, received a disproportionate share. But this was merely the beginning. Basil, grateful and relieved and politically astute, established the regular pay structure for the Varangian Guard at levels that made Byzantine soldiers envious and foreign warriors eager to join. A Varangian guardsman could expect to receive several gold nomismata per month, the exact amount varying based on rank and length of service, but always substantially more than native troops received. To understand what this meant, consider that in Constantinople at this time, a gold nomisma could buy a month's worth of bread for a family, or a good cloak, or several days' worth of meat. A single nomisma was significant wealth for most people in the Byzantine world. The Varangians were receiving multiple nomismata per month, and they had no families to support in Constantinople, no houses to maintain, no local expenses beyond whatever entertainments they chose to pursue. Most of their pay could be saved or sent north. The guardsmen established what would become a tradition: letters home, accompanied by gold. A warrior would write, or more likely pay someone to write for him because many were illiterate, a letter to his family in Scandinavia. The letter would describe his service in general terms, his health, his circumstances, and with the letter would go coins, gold nomismata, stamped with Byzantine emperors' faces, travelling back up the river routes to be delivered to farms and villages where such wealth seemed almost mythical. Imagine receiving such a letter in a small village in Sweden. Your son or brother had gone south 3 years earlier, and you had not known if he was alive or dead. The river roads swallowed men, battles killed them, disease took them. But now here was proof he lived, and with it, more gold than you had seen in your entire life. Enough gold to pay off debts, to buy more land, to improve your farm in ways that would benefit your family for generations. And this was just the regular pay. There were bonuses for specific campaigns, rewards for notable service, opportunities to acquire additional wealth through perfectly legal means. When the emperor toured his provinces, the Varangians accompanied him, and local officials would give gifts to the imperial guard. When foreign ambassadors came to court, they brought presents not only for the emperor, but for his attendants, and the Varangians were prominent attendants. Everything added up. Gold and silver, and valuable objects accumulating in the chests that guardsmen kept in their barracks. The most spectacular windfall came when an emperor died. The famous palace plundering privilege allowed the Varangian Guard, on the death of an emperor they had served, to enter the imperial chambers and take certain portable valuables. This was not unlimited looting. There were customs and restrictions, but it was still an extraordinary right. Gold vessels, jewellery, decorated weapons, fine textiles, all could be claimed by the guardsmen who had protected that emperor in life. Byzantine officials must have found this practice barbaric, a crude remnant of Norse customs about funeral goods and inheritance rights. But the privilege served several purposes. It ensured the guards' loyalty to each emperor personally, because his death enriched them. It created an incentive to protect the emperor's health and safety, and practically, it solved the problem of imperial succession because the guard that had served faithfully under one emperor would be wealthy enough to retire and could be replaced by new recruits under the next emperor, preventing the guard from becoming a hereditary caste with too much political power. For the individual guardsman, the implications were life-changing. A man who served faithfully for 10 or 15 years could accumulate enough wealth to return home as a wealthy man by any standard. He could buy a good farm, marry well, establish his family's fortune. His children would be people of consequence in their communities. His grandchildren would remember him as the ancestor who went to Miklagard and came back with gold. But the wealth came with a price. The guardsmen were living in a foreign city, speaking a foreign language, serving a foreign lord. They were cut off from the normal rhythms of life in Scandinavia, from seasonal festivals and family gatherings, from the simple pleasure of seeing children grow up or fields ripen for harvest. They were professional warriors, which meant that at any moment they might be called to march and fight, and professional warriors died young more often than old. In the barracks and taverns where Varangians gathered, they would have spoken of these trade-offs. The gold was real, heavy in their hands, undeniable in its power to transform lives. But so was the homesickness, the weariness with violence, the recognition that every battle might be the last. They were making a bargain. Their youth, their strength, their willingness to kill and perhaps to die, in exchange for wealth that would elevate their families for generations. Most of them thought it was a fair bargain. The gold was real, after all. The farm back home, the life they might have lived, that was hypothetical. This was concrete, and so they stayed. They fought when called upon to fight. They guarded the emperor when called upon to guard. And they saved their coins and dreamed of the day when they would return north, wealthy and honoured, to tell stories about the city of gold, where they had served the greatest emperor in the world. Between two worlds. The Varangians who served in Constantinople occupied a strange liminal space, caught between the culture they came from and the culture they now inhabited. This position between worlds shaped their identity and their experience in ways both enriching and isolating. The immediate practical problem was language. Most Varangians arrived speaking only Old Norse and perhaps some Slavic words picked up along the river routes. The Byzantines spoke Greek, a language with a completely different structure, different sounds, different writing system. Some formal communication could be managed through interpreters, and the guards' Byzantine officers served this function to some extent. But daily life required at least basic Greek. The guardsmen learned, necessity being an effective teacher. They learned the words for food and drink, for weapons and armour, for basic commands and directions. Some learned much more, becoming fluent enough to converse with Greek speakers, to follow religious services, even to read. These linguistically accomplished Varangians often rose to leadership positions within the guard because they could serve as intermediaries between the Norse warriors and Byzantine officials. But language learning went both directions. Byzantine Greeks in regular contact with the Varangians, especially officers and court officials, learned some Norse words. Certain Norse terms entered Byzantine military vocabulary, particularly words related to the guards' organisation and equipment. It was a small-scale example of cultural exchange, the kind that happens whenever different peoples live and work together for extended periods. Religious practice created another layer of complexity. The Varangians had come from pagan Scandinavia, or from recently Christianized regions like Kiev, where the conversion was still fresh and potentially shallow. Now they found themselves in Constantinople, the most intensely Christian city in the world, where orthodoxy permeated every aspect of life, from imperial ceremonies to daily routines. The guard was expected to participate in Christian worship. They attended services at the palace chapel and at the great churches of Constantinople. They observed the fasts and festivals of the Orthodox calendar. They venerated icons and relics, kissed crosses, and made the sign of the cross before battle. For some, this was a genuine spiritual transformation. The magnificence of Orthodox liturgy, performed in churches of breathtaking beauty, had a powerful effect. Men who had worshipped the old gods in simple wooden structures now attended services where gold and incense and chanting combined to create an overwhelming sensory and spiritual experience. But for others, Christian practice remained something of a performance, rituals observed because they were required but not deeply internalized. These guardsmen might still wear Thor's hammer alongside their cross, might still swear by Odin when angry, might still hold to older ideas about honor and fate that sat uneasily with Christian theology. The Byzantine authorities tolerated this as long as outward conformity was maintained. What mattered was that the Varangians participated in the empire's Christian identity, not necessarily that they held perfect theological understanding. Food was another daily reminder of their foreign status. Constantinople's markets offered incredible variety. Vegetables and fruits unknown in the north, spices from distant lands, wines of every imaginable type. But Scandinavian cuisine was built around different foundations: dried fish and salted meat, barley porridge, ale rather than wine. The Varangians adapted, but they also sought out foods that reminded them of home. When ships arrived from the north, bringing preserved fish or other familiar goods, Varangian guardsmen would pay premium prices for a taste of the familiar. They also adapted Byzantine food to Norse customs. Bread, which was central to Byzantine diet, had been less common in Scandinavia, but the Varangians in Constantinople ate bread, good wheat bread, and came to prefer it. Wine replaced ale, at least for those who could afford good wine. Olive oil, almost unknown in the north, became a regular part of their diet. These adoptions were practical, taking advantage of what was abundant and high quality in their new home. Social life presented its own challenges and opportunities. The Varangians formed a distinct community within Constantinople, living together in their barracks, spending their off-duty time largely in each other's company. This created camaraderie, a shared identity as northerners in a foreign city, but it also meant a certain isolation from broader Byzantine society. Relationships with local women happened. Certainly, Byzantine laws and customs regarding such relationships were complex, and sources don't give us detailed information about how common it was for Varangians to form long-term relationships with Greek women. Some surely did, and some of those relationships produced children who would have grown up between cultures, perhaps speaking both Norse and Greek, participating in both communities, but marriage was complicated. A Varangian guardsman's term of service might last 10 or 20 years. Did he plan to settle in Constantinople permanently, or to return north eventually? If he married a Byzantine woman, would she be willing to leave her homeland and travel to cold, primitive Scandinavia? If he had children, what culture would they belong to? These were questions without easy answers, and they must have caused considerable personal anguish for men trying to build lives in circumstances that didn't fit normal patterns. The guardsmen developed their own hybrid culture, neither purely Norse nor Byzantine, but something in between. They retained Norse language and many Norse customs. The importance of oath-keeping and loyalty, the love of poetry and storytelling, the particular conception of honor that put reputation above life. But they also absorbed Byzantine elements, an appreciation for literature and learning, exposure to philosophical and theological debates, an understanding of court politics and aristocratic culture that was far more sophisticated than anything they would have known in Scandinavia. This hybrid identity meant that when guardsmen eventually returned north, they were changed men. They had seen the wider world. They had lived in the greatest city of their age. They had learned that the Norse way was not the only way, that other peoples had their own sophisticated cultures and traditions. Some embraced this transformation, taking pride in their broader perspective. Others felt alienated from their homelands, finding that they no longer quite fit in villages that had once been their entire world. But while they served in Constantinople, they navigated this space between worlds with varying degrees of success and satisfaction. They were valuable to the emperor precisely because they were foreign, because their outsider status made them reliably loyal. Yet that same foreignness meant they would never fully belong to Byzantine society, would always be the axes at the emperor's door, respected for their strength, but separate from the complex social networks that defined life for Byzantine Greeks. This was their bargain: wealth and glory and purpose, purchased at the price of permanent exile from the simple world of their birth, permanent status as outsiders in the sophisticated world they now inhabited. For most, it seemed a worthwhile trade, but on quiet nights in the barracks, when wine and homesickness combined to loosen tongues, they must have wondered what they had given up, and whether the gold that filled their chests could truly compensate for everything they had left behind. The Palace of Dreams. To understand what it meant to be a Varangian in Constantinople during the reign of Basil II, you must first understand the setting in which they served. The Great Palace was not a single building, but a vast complex of structures, courtyards, gardens, and passages that sprawled across the southeastern promontory of the city, overlooking the Sea of Marmara. It was a city within a city, a world unto itself, and it was unlike anything the men from the north had ever imagined. The palace complex had been growing for centuries, each emperor adding new buildings, new decorations, new marvels. By the late 10th century, after Christ, it covered an area that would take a man half an hour to walk from one end to the other. There were audience halls and throne rooms, private apartments and administrative offices, barracks and stables, churches and chapels, baths and cisterns, gardens and terraces. The whole was connected by covered porticos decorated with mosaics, by underground passages that allowed movement during winter or rain, by staircases that climbed between different levels of the complex. The Varangians who guarded this palace would have spent years learning its geography, memorizing the routes from their barracks to the various locations where they might be stationed. The Chrysotriklinos, the Golden Hall, where the emperor received important visitors, its walls covered in gold mosaic that caught candlelight and lamplight and seemed to glow from within. The octagon, an 8-sided chamber used for certain ceremonies, its dome soaring overhead. The Magnora, the vast audience hall where foreign ambassadors were received with calculated displays of imperial power and wealth. Picture walking these halls as a guardsman on duty. Your boots, good leather boots that you've carefully maintained, make almost no sound on marble floors polished to a mirror shine. The floors themselves are not simple stone but intricate patterns, geometric designs in coloured marble, imported from quarries across the empire. Purple porphyry from Egypt, green serpentine from Sparta, white marble from the islands, all cut and fitted with such precision that the joints are barely visible. The walls rise around you, covered in decoration that transforms stone into something that seems alive. Mosaic work, tiny cubes of coloured glass and stone arranged into images of saints and emperors, of biblical scenes and imperial triumphs. The background is often gold, real gold leaf applied to glass tesserae, creating surfaces that shimmer and shift as you pass, as light moves, as candles flicker. In certain light, at certain times of day, the walls seem to dissolve, to become not barriers, but windows into some other realm, where everything is precious and beautiful and eternal. The ceilings are coffered and painted, decorated with gilded rosettes and intricate patterns. In the major halls, they soar high overhead, creating volumes of space that dwarf even the largest Norse hall. Sound behaves strangely in these spaces. A whisper can carry across a vast room if the acoustics are right. Footsteps echo, the rustle of silk robes, the clink of jewellery. These become audible in the profound silence that often filled the palace when the emperor was in residence, and everyone moved with careful decorum. Light comes from windows covered with thin sheets of alabaster or translucent marble, materials that glow when backlit by sun but which obscure direct views, creating a diffused illumination that softens everything. At night, there are lamps, hundreds of lamps, bronze and silver vessels filled with oil, suspended on chains or set in niches, their flames multiplied by reflection from golden walls, until the major halls are nearly as bright as day. The smell of the palace was distinctive. Incense burned constantly in the churches and chapels, and its scent permeated everything, mixing with the smell of beeswax from candles, of rosewater and other perfumes favoured by courtiers, of the particular mustiness that stone buildings acquire, of cooking from the palace kitchens, of horse and leather from the stables and tack rooms. It was not an unpleasant smell, but it was specific and unmistakable, the olfactory signature of power and wealth and centuries of accumulated living. The gardens provided relief from the stone and gold. The palace complex included several gardens, terraced affairs with fountains and fruit trees, with flower beds that bloomed in succession through the seasons, with covered walkways where one could stroll in shade. Water was everywhere, flowing from fountains, filling pools, creating the constant musical background of splashing and trickling. For men from the north, accustomed to water as something cold and often threatening, these ornamental waterworks must have seemed like pure luxury. Water tamed and made beautiful. The Varangians had their own quarters within the complex, barracks that were comfortable by military standards, though certainly not as luxurious as the imperial apartments. They slept in dormitory-style rooms, each man with a bed and a chest for his possessions. There was a common hall where they ate, where they could gather when off duty, where they maintained weapons and armour and told stories, and gambled and did all the things that soldiers do when not actively soldiering. But they also had the run of much of the palace, at least the public and semi-public areas. They stood guard in the throne rooms and audience chambers. They accompanied the emperor through corridors and gardens. They were present at banquets and ceremonies, standing silent and watchful, while Byzantine aristocrats conducted their elaborate social rituals. This gave them an intimate view of Byzantine court life, of its protocols and intrigues, its beauty, and its occasional absurdity. The Byzantines maintained strict ceremonial protocols. Every occasion had its proper procedure, its designated participants, its prescribed sequence of actions. When the emperor held an audience, everyone from the highest-ranking general to the lowest servant had an assigned position. People approached the throne in a specific order. They prostrated themselves, rising only when given permission. They spoke only when addressed. The whole was choreographed like an elaborate performance, designed to reinforce the emperor's elevated status and the hierarchical nature of Byzantine society. For the Varangians, witnessing these ceremonies was both fascinating and slightly ridiculous. Norse culture valued directness and a certain rough equality among free men. The idea of prostrating yourself before anyone, even a king, was foreign. Yet here they were, guarding an emperor whose subjects treated him as semi-divine, whose every public appearance was surrounded by ritual that made Norse royal courts seem casual by comparison. But they adapted. They learned to stand perfectly still for hours, their axes resting on their shoulders in the prescribed manner. They learned to ignore the whispered conversations of courtiers, to show no reaction to political dramas playing out before them, to be simultaneously present and invisible, guardians who were seen but not supposed to see, who heard everything but were trusted to repeat nothing. At night, when formal ceremonies ended and the emperor retired to his private quarters, the palace transformed. The vast public halls were left to guards and servants. Lamps were extinguished in all but essential areas. The complex became a maze of shadows and dim passages, of echoing footsteps and distant sounds. This was when the Varangians earned their keep. maintaining watches through the dark hours, ensuring that no assassin could approach the emperor, no conspiracy could unfold unchecked. They walked the corridors in pairs, passing other guards at designated intervals, creating a web of security that covered the entire complex. They knew which doors should be locked, which passages should be empty, which sounds were normal, and which might indicate trouble. It was simultaneously boring and essential work, hours of routine punctuated by the possibility of sudden violence, and through it all, through the years of service, they remained somewhat apart from it all. They were in this palace, but not of it. They guarded this emperor, but were not Byzantine. They lived amid opulence that would have amazed their ancestors, but saved their wages and dreamed of farms in the north. They were the axes of Byzantium, essential to its security, but they would never truly belong to the world they protected. The palace was their workplace, their home for years at a time, the setting for their daily lives, but it was also fundamentally alien, a place built on assumptions and values that were not quite theirs, no matter how long they served. This tension, between immersion in Byzantine culture and maintenance of Norse identity, defined the Varangian experience. They were between worlds, permanently, and the great palace was the golden, glittering cage that held them. You walk the morning watch. You are standing in the octagon chamber, and dawn is breaking over Constantinople. The night watch is ending, and you are tired in the particular way that comes from staying alert through dark hours, from fighting the body's desire for sleep, from the mental exhaustion of vigilance. Light enters through the high windows, not yet direct sunlight, but the grey-pink illumination of early morning. It catches on the golden mosaic of the dome overhead, and slowly, that gold begins to warm. You have watched this happen 100 times, the transformation of the chamber from shadow to glory as day arrives, but it never ceases to hold your attention. Your axe rests on your shoulder, its weight familiar now after years of service. The haft is smooth from countless hands, from your own hands gripping and shifting it during long watches. The blade is clean, sharp, ceremonial perhaps, but no less deadly for that. You have killed men with axes like this one, though not here in the palace. Never here. Here the axe is symbol and promise, a reminder of what the Varangian Guard represents. Your mail shirt, worn over a padded undertunic, has settled into a comfortable weight across your shoulders. You barely notice it anymore, except when you remove it at the end of a watch, and feel suddenly, strangely light. Your boots are planted firmly on marble that is cold even through thick leather soles, geometric patterns in purple and white that you have long since memorized without meaning to. The chamber is silent, except for the small sounds of the palace waking. Somewhere distant, someone is sweeping. The rhythmic scrape of a broom on stone. Footsteps pass in an outer corridor, servants beginning their morning routines. The palace contains thousands of people, and in the early hours, before the emperor rises and ceremonies begin, you can hear the domestic hum of all those lives. You are not alone. Your watch partner stands on the opposite side of the chamber, equally still, equally alert. You cannot see him without turning your head, and you do not turn your head because guardsmen on watch do not fidget, do not move unnecessarily, do not display any sign of restlessness or inattention. But you know he is there. You can sense his presence the way soldiers learn to sense their companions, and that presence is reassuring. If something happens, if somehow an intruder penetrates this deep into the palace, you will not face it alone. The mosaic saints on the walls watch you with their large, dark eyes. In the growing light, their faces emerge from shadow, gaining dimension and expression. There is a panel showing the Virgin Mary with the Christ child, her robes an impossible blue, made from lapis lazuli, her face serene and slightly sad. There is Saint Demetrius in military dress, appropriate for a soldier saint, his hand raised in blessing. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Thousands upon thousands of tiny stones, arranged so precisely that from even a few feet away they read as smooth surfaces, as realistic flesh and fabric. You think, as you have thought many times during these watches, about the distance between this place and the farm where you were born. If your younger self could see you now, what would he think? A stone chamber larger than his entire village, walls that cost more than everyone in that village would earn in their lifetimes, standing guard over an emperor whose power extends across lands you have never seen and probably never will see. It seems impossible, and yet here you are. Your stomach reminds you that breakfast awaits when this watch ends. The palace feeds its guards well, better food than you ever ate at home. Fresh bread this morning, you expect, and cheese and perhaps some of the small salted fish that you have come to enjoy. Wine to drink, though you will water it heavily because you need to sleep after this watch ends, and strong wine interferes with sleep. A door opens somewhere in the palace, the sound carrying clearly through the morning quiet. You register it, identify it as normal, dismiss it. You have learned to distinguish the sounds that matter from those that don't, the footsteps of someone who belongs from those that seem wrong, the routine openings and closings from those that suggest something unusual. It is a skill developed over years, an instinct that operates below conscious thought. The light continues to strengthen. Now there is direct sun coming through the eastern windows, long beams that cut across the chamber, illuminating dust motes that drift in the air. Where the light strikes golden mosaic, it creates brilliant points of reflection, scattered stars against the walls. The chamber transforms minute by minute, becoming what it was designed to be, a space that inspires awe and reminds visitors of the empire's majesty. You hear the bells then, the church bells from across the city, beginning their morning calls to prayer. Constantinople has hundreds of churches, and their bells ring at intervals throughout the day, creating a soundscape that is uniquely Byzantine. The sound washes over the city like waves, layers of bronze tones overlapping and fading. You have grown accustomed to this music, have learned to tell time by which bells are ringing, have found a strange comfort in the regular rhythm of sacred time marking the passage of secular hours. Your replacement arrives precisely when expected. You can hear his approach, the deliberate footsteps of a guardsman coming to take his station. He enters the chamber, nods to you with minimal movement, takes his position. You are released. You step down from your position carefully, maintaining dignity, still on duty until you leave the chamber. Your partner on the opposite side has similarly been relieved, and together you walk out, your watch completed without incident, as most watches are, as you hope all watches will be, though you remain ready for the possibility that one day something will happen, that the oath you swore will be tested, that the axe you carry will be needed for its original purpose. The corridor outside is brighter, and you blink against it. Your body begins to relax, muscles that have been held in careful stillness for hours releasing their tension. You are hungry and tired and satisfied, with another watch completed, another night during which no harm came to the emperor you guard, another small contribution to the security of an empire that, for all its strangeness, has become your home. The axes of heaven. The reputation of the Varangian Guard for absolute loyalty became one of the defining features of Byzantine politics in the 11th century after Christ. While other military units might be bribed, while Byzantine generals might harbour imperial ambitions, while aristocratic families plotted and schemed for advantage, the Varangian Guard stood apart from all such machinations. They served the emperor, whichever emperor sat on the throne, with a fidelity that Byzantine observers found both admirable and slightly mysterious. This loyalty was not merely a useful fiction or political propaganda. It was real, demonstrated repeatedly in circumstances where Byzantine units faltered or where the temptation to betray must have been substantial. The foundation of this loyalty lay in the cultural values the Varangians brought from the north, values that did not translate perfectly into the Byzantine context, but which served imperial interests remarkably well. In Scandinavian culture, a warrior's relationship with his lord was fundamentally personal. You did not serve an institution or a dynasty, but a man to whom you had sworn an oath. That oath was sacred, more binding than law, more important than life. To break such an oath was to forfeit honor, and honor was the thing that made a man valuable, that gave his life meaning. A warrior without honor was neathing, a wretch, someone whose existence was shameful. Death was preferable to such dishonor, and not merely death, but any suffering, any sacrifice, any hardship. When a Varangian swore the oath to the Byzantine emperor, he was not thinking primarily about political legitimacy or dynastic rights. These were Byzantine concerns, subtle questions about succession law and aristocratic privilege. The Varangian was thinking about his oath, about his honor, about the fact that he had given his word. Once given, his word bound him absolutely. This created a peculiar situation. A Byzantine general, when deciding whether to support a rebel, would calculate advantages and disadvantages, would consider family connections and promises of rewards, would think about which side was likely to win. A Varangian guardsman, faced with the same decision, would simply remember his oath. He had sworn to defend the emperor, therefore, he would defend the emperor. The calculation was that simple, that absolute. Byzantine sources from the period repeatedly comment on this quality. Michael Psellos, who knew several Byzantine emperors personally, and who was a keen observer of court politics, wrote with something like amazement about the Varangians' loyalty. He described them as men who could not be corrupted, who maintained their duty even when it would have been easy and profitable to abandon it. Other chroniclers made similar observations, often with an implicit criticism of Byzantine troops who lacked such steadfastness. This reputation had practical effects. Emperors could trust the Varangian Guard in situations where they could trust no one else. When an emperor faced a rebellion by a powerful general, he knew the Varangians would fight for him, regardless of the military odds or the general's popularity. When an emperor needed to suppress a conspiracy among the aristocracy, he could use Varangians to arrest the conspirators, without fearing that the guardsmen would side with the nobles. When an emperor's own Byzantine troops seemed unreliable, he could position the Varangians as the core of his defense. This utility made the Varangian Guard extremely valuable, despite their relatively small numbers and high cost. A few thousand absolutely loyal soldiers were worth more than tens of thousands of questionably loyal ones, at least in the context of Byzantine politics, where internal threats were as dangerous as external enemies. The Varangians were insurance against betrayal, a guarantee that the emperor would always have some force that could not be turned against him. But there were limits to this loyalty, or perhaps more precisely, there were careful definitions of where loyalty applied. The Varangians swore to serve the emperor, but if the emperor died and a new emperor took the throne, their oath transferred to the new ruler. They were loyal to the office, not to a dynasty. This meant that if an emperor was deposed or assassinated, and someone else successfully claimed the throne, the Varangians would serve the new emperor with the same absolute fidelity they had shown the old one. This might seem like a loophole, a weakness in their famous loyalty. After all, if they would serve whoever held power, were they truly loyal or merely opportunistic? But from the Varangian perspective, this made perfect sense. They had sworn to serve the emperor of the Romans. When a new emperor was established, recognized, crowned, he became the emperor of the Romans, and therefore he became the object of their oath. They were not oath-bound to prevent someone from becoming emperor, only to serve whoever succeeded in claiming that position. Byzantine politics being what they were, this created some awkward situations. There were moments when emperors were forcibly removed from power, when coups succeeded and new dynasties began. In these transitions, the Varangian Guard's role was carefully passive. They would not help conspirators against a sitting emperor, but once that emperor was deposed and a new emperor installed, they would guard the new ruler with the same dedication they had shown the old. This might seem cynical, but it was actually perfectly consistent with the oath they had sworn, and it provided a kind of stability to the Byzantine system, knowing that the Varangian Guard would serve whoever legitimately held the throne meant that political transitions, however violent, did not destroy the Guard itself. The institution persisted across dynastic changes, providing continuity even when everything else was in flux. The loyalty extended beyond merely guarding the emperor's person. The Varangians were known for keeping their word in all circumstances. If they were told to hold a position, they would hold it until death or until ordered to withdraw. If they were given custody of a prisoner, that prisoner would not escape. If they were entrusted with valuables, those valuables would not be stolen. This reliability made them useful for tasks beyond simple guard duty. Emperors used Varangians as couriers for especially sensitive messages, knowing they could not be bribed to reveal the contents. They were used to guard imperial treasuries because they would not steal. They were used to execute judicial punishments on high-ranking Byzantine nobles because they would carry out orders without being swayed by pleas or threats or family connections. They became, in effect, the emperor's tool for all tasks requiring absolute reliability. This reputation followed them even into retirement. A Varangian who returned to Scandinavia after years of service carried with him the knowledge that he had been trusted by the emperor of the Romans, that he had served faithfully in the most powerful court in the world. This was a mark of distinction, a claim to honor that elevated his status in his home community. And because the Varangians guarded their reputation so carefully, because each guardsman knew that his conduct reflected on all Varangians, the standard was maintained across generations. The Byzantines called them the axes of heaven, a poetic phrase that captured both their military function and their moral standing. They were weapons in the emperor's hand, deadly and effective, but they were also, in some metaphorical sense, heaven-sent, embodying virtues that Byzantine society valued but struggled to maintain among its own citizens. They were foreign barbarians, yes, but they were also, paradoxically, moral exemplars, men whose word could be trusted absolutely in a world where trust was rare and precious. Battle music, Sicily and Bulgaria. The Varangian Guard's loyalty and reliability were tested repeatedly on battlefields across the empire during the reign of Basil II and his immediate successors. These were not ceremonial soldiers whose primary duty was standing in palace corridors, though they did that too. They were combat troops, and Byzantine emperors used them as such, deploying them in the hard campaigns that defined the empire's golden age in the late 10th and early 11th centuries after Christ. Sicily, in the 990s, after Christ, was a complicated situation. The island had been under Arab Muslim control for more than a century, but Byzantine ambitions to reclaim it remained strong. The strategic importance of Sicily was obvious. It sat at the centre of the Mediterranean, controlling sea routes between east and west. It was wealthy, productive, capable of generating substantial revenue, and historically it had been Roman, then Byzantine, before the Arab conquest, so there was a claim to legitimacy in attempting to retake it. The campaign that brought Varangians to Sicily was part of a broader Byzantine offensive in southern Italy. Byzantine forces, including a substantial Varangian contingent, landed on the island and began the difficult work of siege warfare against fortified Arab positions. This was different from the open field battle of Abydos. This was grinding, patient work, surrounding cities, and waiting for hunger and disease to do what assault might not accomplish. The Varangians earned their reputation in these sieges through their willingness to lead assaults on walls. Siege warfare in this period was extraordinarily dangerous. Defenders on walls had every advantage. They could drop stones and pour boiling liquids on attackers trying to scale ladders or approach gates. They could shoot arrows and throw spears with relative safety. Attackers climbing walls were vulnerable, burdened with weapons and armor, unable to defend themselves effectively until they reached the top. But the Varangians would do it. When an assault was ordered, when someone had to lead the climb up siege ladders under a rain of projectiles, the Varangians volunteered, or were volunteered, by their commanders, who knew they would not shirk. They climbed with their axes strapped to their backs, using both hands on the ladders, racing to reach the top before defenders could push the ladders away from the walls. Those who survived the climb would engage in brutal hand-to-hand combat on narrow wall walks, where there was no room for sophisticated tactics, only strength and ferocity and the willingness to kill or die. Not all such assaults succeeded. Many Varangians died on those walls, crushed by stones, burned by hot oil, cut down by defenders once they reached the top. But some assaults did succeed, and when they did, when the Varangians forced their way onto the walls and held their position long enough for more troops to follow, cities fell. The campaign in Sicily was ultimately inconclusive. Byzantine forces achieved some success, but did not reclaim the entire island. But the Varangian Guard added to its reputation for courage under impossible circumstances. Bulgaria was different. Bulgaria was personal for Basil II. The Bulgarian Empire, under Tsar Samuel, had been a thorn in Byzantine sides for decades, occupying territories that Byzantium claimed, threatening Byzantine cities in the Balkans, generally presenting itself as a rival power that challenged Byzantine supremacy in the region. Basil committed himself to destroying Bulgarian power, and the campaign that followed would last for years, and would ultimately earn him the nickname by which history remembers him, Basil the Bulgar Slayer. The Varangian Guard accompanied Basil on these Bulgarian campaigns through the first 2 decades of the 11th century after Christ. This was mountain warfare, very different from the plains of Abydos or the siege warfare of Sicily. The Balkans are rugged, full of steep valleys and narrow passes, places where large armies struggle to operate and where ambushes are easy to arrange. The Bulgarians knew their terrain and used it well, avoiding large pitched battles when possible, striking at supply lines, forcing Byzantine forces to fight on disadvantageous ground. The Varangians adapted. They learned to fight in mountains, to navigate steep terrain while burdened with weapons and armour, to guard passes and convoy supplies through hostile territory. They served as the reliable core of Basil's army, the troops who could be counted on to hold their positions when other units might panic in the face of Bulgarian attacks. The campaign was brutal, characterized by a harshness that shocked even contemporaries who were accustomed to medieval warfare's cruelties. Basil was determined not merely to defeat Bulgarian armies, but to break Bulgarian will to resist. After the decisive Battle of Kleidion in 1014 after Christ, where Byzantine forces finally achieved a crushing victory over the main Bulgarian army, Basil ordered a punishment that would become infamous. He took thousands of Bulgarian prisoners, blinded most of them completely, and sent them back to Tsar Samuel, led by men who had been left with sight in one eye. The sources say that Samuel died of shock upon seeing his blinded army. Whether the Varangians participated in this blinding is unclear from the sources. It was carried out on Basil's orders, and one assumes his troops, including the Varangians, would have obeyed. This raises uncomfortable questions about the nature of loyalty and about the moral implications of following orders, regardless of their content. The Varangians prided themselves on oath-keeping, on serving faithfully, but when the emperor ordered actions that were cruel by any standard, did their oath require participation? The sources don't tell us if individual guardsmen wrestled with such questions, but it seems likely that some must have. The Bulgarian campaigns ended with complete Byzantine victory. By 1018 after Christ, the Bulgarian Empire ceased to exist as an independent state, its territories absorbed into the Byzantine Empire. Basil had achieved what he set out to accomplish, had eliminated a major threat to Byzantine power in the Balkans. The Varangian Guard, which had served throughout these years of mountain warfare, had proven their value not just in single, dramatic battles, but in the grinding, unglamorous work of long campaigns. After Bulgaria, during the reign of Basil's successors, the Varangians continued to campaign across the empire. They fought in Armenia against local princes and Arab raiders. They fought in Syria, again against Arab forces. They served in campaigns in southern Italy, in the ongoing attempt to maintain Byzantine influence in a region contested by multiple powers. They were deployed wherever the empire needed. Reliable shock troops, wherever the emperor needed soldiers, who would follow orders without calculation or hesitation. Each campaign added to their reputation. Stories circulated about Varangian valor, about guardsmen who held impossible positions, who made desperate charges against overwhelming odds, who died rather than retreat. Some of these stories were true, others were embellished. But collectively, they created an image of the Varangian Guard as warriors without equal, men who combined Norse ferocity with disciplined service in ways that made them invaluable to Byzantine military power. But combat was never glorious, the way poets pretended. It was exhausting and terrifying, and frequently boring. Long marches through difficult terrain, inadequate food, and contaminated water. Disease that killed more men than battles. The constant awareness that any day might bring sudden violence and death. The Varangians endured this because that was what they had agreed to do, because their oath bound them, because going home, wealthy and honoured, required surviving years of service first. They fought because fighting was what they were paid to do, and they fought well because fighting poorly meant dying, and because their reputation, their collective honour, depended on maintaining standards that had been established at Abydos and that could not be allowed to decline. The price of loyalty. His name was Calf, and he stood outside the private chamber of Emperor Constantine VIII, and he was about to commit murder on behalf of a man he despised. Constantine was old, dying actually, though he clung to life with a tenacity that seemed almost spiteful. He had been a poor emperor by any measure, more interested in personal pleasure than governance, allowing others to rule while he enjoyed the privileges of the throne. But he wore the purple. He sat on the throne that had been occupied by Constantine the Great and Justinian and Basil II, and that meant he was the emperor, and the emperor's person was sacred. Inside the chamber was a man whose name Calf did not know and did not need to know, a courtier, an aristocrat, someone who had displeased Constantine in some way that Byzantine politics made significant. The emperor, in one of his rare moments of direct action, had ordered the man's execution, not publicly, not with trial or ceremony, but quietly, in his chambers, carried out by trusted servants who would not speak of it afterward. The Varangian guard had been given the task. Calf and one other guardsman would enter, would kill the man efficiently and without fuss, would leave his body for the imperial servants to dispose of. It was not the first time guardsmen had been used for such purposes. Emperors sometimes needed people killed, and the Varangians could be trusted to do it without asking questions, without being bribed to report details to whoever asked, without letting sentiment interfere with duty. Calf had been serving for 7 years. He had fought at sieges, had killed men in battle, had grown accustomed to violence in the way that professional soldiers must. But those men had been enemies, armed men trying to kill him. This was different. This was assassination, carrying out a sentence that might be just or might be caprice. Calf had no way to know. He had spent the hours since receiving the order trying to think of ways to refuse. Could he claim illness? Could he request reassignment? Could he simply say, no, this was beneath his honour. This was not what he had sworn to do. But the oath was clear. He had sworn to serve the emperor, to follow orders, to be the emperor's instrument. The oath did not include exceptions for orders he found distasteful. The oath did not allow him to judge whether commands were worthy. The oath bound him absolutely. His companion for this task was older, a man named Asmund, who had been in the guard for 15 years. Asmund had a face like weathered wood and eyes that showed nothing. When they were told what they were to do, Asmund had simply nodded, checked his weapons, and waited. Perhaps he had done this before. Perhaps he had learned not to think too much about what duty required. The signal came. They entered the chamber. The man inside looked up, fear on his face, understanding immediately what their presence meant. He began to plead, words in Greek that Calf barely understood, something about mercy, about his family, about his innocence. Calf's Greek was good enough for simple conversation, for orders and directions, but not for nuanced arguments. Even if it had been, what difference would it make? The emperor had ordered this. The oath demanded obedience. It was quick. Asmund moved first, professional and efficient, and Calf followed, and the man died without crying out, without time for more than that initial fear. They left him on the floor, blood spreading across marble, and walked out, past other guardsmen who stood at attention and did not look at them, back to the barracks where they cleaned their weapons and said nothing to each other about what they had done. Calf lay in his bed that night, unable to sleep. He thought about honour, about oaths, about the difference between the clean violence of battle and this secret killing in a palace chamber. He thought about the gold that waited for him when his service ended, the farm he would buy, the respect he would command. He wondered if that gold was worth this, if any amount of wealth could compensate for what he had become. In the morning, he stood his watch as always. He performed his duties as always. The oath demanded it. His honour required it, and Calf, like all the Varangians, valued his honour more than his comfort, more than his moral qualms, more perhaps than his soul. He had sworn. That was enough. It had to be enough, because the alternative was to break his oath, to become Neithinger, to lose the thing that made him valuable, that made his life meaningful. Better to carry this weight, this stain, than to forfeit honour. This was the price of loyalty that the chronicles did not record, the cost that came with absolute obedience. The Varangian guard served the emperor without calculation, without moral judgment, and sometimes that service required them to be not just warriors, but instruments of imperial will, acting in ways that might haunt them, but which their oaths demanded they perform without hesitation or regret. Wealth beyond measure. The famous palace plundering privilege of the Varangian guard was more than just a curious custom. It was a fundamental part of the economic relationship between the guardsman and the emperor, a reward structure that ensured loyalty through the promise of spectacular wealth at specific moments. The basic operation was this. When an emperor died, the Varangian guard was permitted to enter the imperial private chambers and take portable valuables up to a certain weight or value. This happened before the new emperor was formally installed, during that liminal period when the throne was technically vacant. The guardsmen would process through the chambers, selecting items that caught their eye, gold vessels and jewellery, and decorated weapons and fine fabrics. Anything they could carry that met the criteria for being portable imperial property. Byzantine officials must have found this practice deeply foreign. In Byzantine culture, imperial property was sacrosanct. The treasury was carefully accounted for, every item catalogued, every transfer documented. The idea of allowing barbarian soldiers to simply take things, to help themselves to imperial wealth, violated every principle of proper administration. Yet the practice continued for centuries, which suggests it served important purposes, beyond merely enriching the guardsmen. First, it aligned the guards' interests with the emperor's longevity. A living emperor paid regular wages, but a dead emperor provided this one-time windfall. The guards had no incentive to hasten an emperor's death. Indeed, they had strong incentive to protect his health and safety, because the longer he lived, the more regular pay they received, and the windfall would come eventually regardless. This was clever structuring, creating a financial incentive that reinforced the moral obligation of the oath. Second, it helped manage the generational transition within the guard itself. A guardsman who served during one emperor's reign and benefited from the palace plundering, when that emperor died, would often choose to retire, returning north with his accumulated wages, plus this final bonus. This meant that each new emperor started with a guard that included both experienced veterans and newer recruits, creating continuity while also allowing regular turnover. If guardsmen had served for decades across multiple reigns, the guard might have become a hereditary institution with its own political interests. The palace plundering privilege encouraged retirement at natural transition points. Third, it served as a spectacular advertisement for Varangian service. Stories of the palace plundering travelled back to Scandinavia, carried by retired guardsmen or by merchants. These stories described wealth beyond normal imagination. Rooms full of gold and jewels, guardsmen loading themselves with treasure, riches that would make their families wealthy for generations. Such stories ensured a steady stream of recruits, young warriors, willing to travel to Constantinople for the chance at such rewards. The amounts involved could be staggering. When Emperor Basil II died in 1025 after Christ, he had reigned for nearly 50 years, longer than any emperor in Byzantine history. He had accumulated enormous wealth through successful campaigns, through careful management of imperial finances, through decades of tribute and taxation. His private chambers contained treasures that represented a lifetime of imperial collecting. The Varangian guard that served during his final years and benefited from his death became legendarily wealthy. Individual guardsmen could return home with what amounted to small fortunes. A man might carry back 10 or 20 pounds of gold in various forms, coins and vessels and jewellery. At a time when a good farm might cost the equivalent of 5 or 10 pounds of gold, such wealth was life-changing. It was generational wealth, enough to elevate a family from modest circumstances to local prominence, enough to ensure that children and grandchildren would remember the ancestor who went to Miklagard and came back rich. But the wealth also created complications. A man returning to Scandinavia with such riches had to be careful. He might be robbed on the journey home. He might face claims from relatives who felt entitled to share in his fortune. He might be targeted by local strongmen who wanted to appropriate his wealth. Many veterans chose to invest quickly upon returning, buying land and establishing themselves before word of their wealth spread too widely. The palace plundering was only the most spectacular part of Varangian wealth accumulation. Regular wages were generous, as we've discussed, but there were other opportunities as well. When the emperor toured his provinces, local governors would give gifts to the imperial guard. When foreign ambassadors arrived, they brought presents for the emperor's attendants. During campaigns, there was legitimate plunder from defeated enemies. All of this added up. A guardsman who served faithfully for 10 or 15 years could expect to accumulate wealth equivalent to what a successful merchant might earn in a lifetime, perhaps more. This was not wealth on the scale of Byzantine aristocrats, who controlled vast estates and thousands of servants. But by the standards of Scandinavia, or the Slavic lands, it was extraordinary prosperity. The economic impact on Scandinavia itself is difficult to measure, but was probably substantial. Gold coins with Byzantine emperors' faces, circulated in Sweden and Norway, physical evidence of the Varangian connection. This gold funded improvements in agriculture, investment in ships and trading expeditions, construction of larger and more elaborate buildings. It also funded the conversion to Christianity, because churches and priests required resources, and returning Varangians often used their wealth to build churches and support religious institutions. There was social impact as well. Families with Varangian connections gained status. A farm owned by the father of a guardsman, or by a returned guardsman himself, had prestige beyond its economic value. These families formed networks, connected through their Byzantine experiences, sharing information and maintaining trading relationships with Constantinople. In some regions, Varangian service became almost hereditary, sons following fathers into the guard, creating dynasties of Byzantine service. But wealth alone did not guarantee happiness. Some returned guardsmen struggled to readjust to northern life. After years in Constantinople, with its sophistication and comfort and cultural richness, Scandinavian villages could seem primitive and boring. A man who had walked marble halls and stood guard in throne rooms might find it difficult to be content farming barley and raising cattle. Some retired guardsmen became restless, investing in trading ventures or raiding expeditions, seeking adventure, because settled life no longer satisfied them. And there was always the question of cost. Was the wealth worth the years away from home, the danger, the moral compromises that service sometimes required? Each guardsman had to answer that for himself. For most, the answer was yes. The gold was real, heavy in their hands, undeniable proof that their service had meaning and value. Whatever else might be said about their choices, they had won wealth and honour, had elevated their families, had left their mark in societies where most men lived and died in poverty, where fortune was determined largely by birth. The Varangian Guard offered a path to something better. That path was hard and dangerous, but it was open, and thousands of warriors over 3 centuries chose to walk it, accepting all that came with it in exchange for gold and glory in the service of the Emperor of the Romans. Harold's arrival. In the spring of 1034 after Christ, a ship arrived in Constantinople carrying a young Norse prince who would become the most famous Varangian in history. His name was Harald Sigurdsson, though history would remember him as Harald Hardrada, Harald Hard Ruler. He was 19 years old, exiled from Norway, ambitious beyond measure, and he would spend the next decade in Byzantine service, building the reputation and accumulating the wealth that would eventually allow him to seize the Norwegian throne. Harold's arrival in Constantinople was not that of a common warrior seeking employment. He was a prince of the Norwegian royal house, half-brother to Saint Olaf, who had been king of Norway until his death in battle 3 years earlier. After Olaf's fall, Harold had fought in the civil wars that followed, had been wounded at the Battle of Stiklestad where his half-brother died, and had fled first to Sweden and then to Rus territory to escape his enemies. From Kiev, where he spent time at the court of Prince Yaroslav, Harold looked south to Constantinople. He needed gold to fund his eventual attempt to reclaim power in Norway. He needed military experience and reputation. And he needed distance from Scandinavia, while his enemies consolidated their power. Byzantine service offered all of these. Moreover, his royal connections gave him an advantage. He was not just another warrior seeking employment, but a prince in exile, someone who could expect command positions, rather than starting at the bottom of the guard hierarchy. He arrived in Constantinople with a personal following, warriors who had attached themselves to him during his time in Rus territory, men who saw potential in serving a young prince with ambition and royal blood. The Byzantine emperor at the time was Michael IV, a man who had risen to the throne through marriage to Empress Zoe, one of the most fascinating and controversial figures in Byzantine history. Michael was capable, but physically weak, suffering from epilepsy, and he relied heavily on his brothers and other advisors to manage the empire. Harold was received at court and admitted to the Varangian Guard with a rank appropriate to his status. Byzantine emperors had experience with exiled princes, Scandinavian politics produced them regularly, and there was the established protocol for how to handle high-born foreigners seeking service. Give them honours and positions suitable to their birth. Use them to enhance your military forces and maintain friendly relations with their homelands, which might prove valuable in the future. For Harold, the arrival in Constantinople must have been both thrilling and slightly disappointing. Thrilling because the city exceeded even the grand descriptions he would have heard. No words could truly capture the scale and sophistication of the Byzantine capital, and experiencing it firsthand was overwhelming, but also disappointing because he was no longer a prince in anything but name. Here he was a foreign guardsman, well treated but fundamentally subordinate, one warrior among thousands in an empire that had its own priorities and concerns. Harold was described by contemporaries as tall, even by Norse standards, physically strong, with fair hair and a commanding presence. He was intelligent, capable of learning Greek more quickly than most Varangians managed, understanding Byzantine politics with a sophistication that came from his own experience in Norwegian royal courts. He was also ruthless, willing to do whatever advanced his interests, untroubled by moral qualms when they conflicted with ambition. The Varangian Guard that Harold joined in 1034 was at the height of its reputation and effectiveness. The guardsmen who had served under Basil II were retired or dead by this point, but they had established traditions and standards that later generations maintained. The Guard was exclusively Norse at this point, still several decades before the English influx that would change its character. It was the elite military unit of the empire, envied and respected, and joining it meant entering a brotherhood of warriors who took fierce pride in their reputation. Harold would have undergone the oath-taking ceremony, swearing to serve the emperor and protect his life. For Harold, this oath was probably more pragmatic than spiritual. He needed employment, needed the position that guard service provided, and he was willing to swear whatever oaths were required. But he would keep that oath as long as it served his purposes, and Byzantine service would serve his purposes remarkably well for the next decade. His arrival marked a new phase in Varangian history, the beginning of what might be called the era of legendary individuals. The early years of the Guard, from its formation under Basil II through the first decades of the 11th century, had established the institution and its reputation. Now would come the period when specific named guardsmen, particularly Harold, but others as well, would achieve fame that transcended the collective reputation of the unit. These were warriors whose individual exploits would be remembered in sagas, whose careers would become the stuff of legend, whose stories would inspire future generations of young warriors to seek service in Constantinople. Harold was the most prominent of these legendary figures, but he was not alone. The Varangian Guard in the middle of the 11th century, after Christ, contained warriors from across Scandinavia, each with his own story, his own reasons for coming south, his own ambitions and dreams. Some sought wealth, others glory, still others simply adventure and escape from circumstances at home. Together they formed a community of exiles and adventurers, men who had chosen to leave the familiar world of the north to serve in the magnificent, strange, dangerous capital of the Byzantine Empire. And at the centre of this community, for the next 10 years, would be Harold Sigurdsson, the exiled prince who would earn his nickname Hardrada through exploits that combined tactical brilliance, physical courage, and utter ruthlessness. His story was just beginning, and it would take him from Constantinople to Sicily, to the Holy Land, and eventually back to Norway, where he would die at the Battle of Stamford Bridge in 1066, trying to conquer England in one final grand gamble. But that end was 30 years in the future. In 1034, he was a young warrior, newly arrived in the greatest city in the world, ready to make his mark, the Thunderbolt of the North. Harold Hardrada's decade of service in the Varangian Guard was marked by campaigns across the empire and beyond, each one adding to his growing reputation as a warrior and commander. The sources for this period come primarily from Norse sagas, particularly the Heimskringla and other Icelandic texts, which present Harold as a hero and are therefore probably embellished. But the basic outline of his service is confirmed by Byzantine sources, and even allowing for exaggeration, his accomplishments were remarkable. The first major campaign that featured Harold prominently was in Sicily and southern Italy, where Byzantine forces were engaged in the ongoing struggle to maintain and extend imperial control in a region contested by multiple powers. The Normans were beginning their conquest of southern Italy, Arab forces controlled much of Sicily, and local Italian powers pursued their own interests. Into this complicated situation came Byzantine armies, including substantial Varangian contingents, and among those Varangians was Harold. The campaign in Sicily, during the late 1030s after Christ involved numerous sieges and pitched battles. Harold distinguished himself in these engagements through tactics that combined Norse cunning with what he learned about Byzantine warfare. One story, which appears in multiple sources and may actually be true, involves Harold's capture of a Sicilian town through deception. Unable to take the town by assault, Harold allegedly ordered his men to catch small birds that nested in the town. They attached small pieces of cloth soaked in sulfur and wax to the birds' feet, lit them on fire, and released the birds, which flew back to their nests in the town's thatched roofs. The roofs caught fire, forcing the defenders to focus on fighting the flames, at which point Harold's forces assaulted and captured the town. Whether this specific story is true or not, it represents the kind of tactical innovation that characterized Harold's approach to warfare. Another story from the Sicilian campaign involves Harold using a ruse to enter a town whose defences seemed impregnable. He sent word to the defenders that he had died, and that his men wished to bury him in the church inside the town, asking for safe passage for the funeral procession. When the gates were opened to admit the supposed funeral party, Harold, very much alive, led his warriors in an attack that captured the town. Again, the story might be embellished or even invented, but it reflects Harold's reputation for using deception and psychological warfare alongside straightforward military skill. Harold fought in the Bulgarian region as well, though by his time the major Bulgarian wars were over. He participated in campaigns against remaining pockets of resistance and against raiders who threatened imperial territories in the Balkans. The mountainous terrain of this region provided opportunities for the kind of small unit tactics at which the Varangians excelled, ambushing enemies in narrow valleys, holding passes against superior numbers, conducting raids that struck fast and withdrew before enemy reinforcements could arrive. But perhaps Harold's most famous campaign was in the Holy Land. The Byzantine Empire had interests in the Levant, and conflicts with Arab forces were ongoing. Harold led Varangian contingents in operations in Syria and Palestine in the early 1040s after Christ. The Norse sagas claim he visited Jerusalem itself and bathed in the Jordan River, though Byzantine sources don't confirm these specific details. What is clear is that he fought effectively in the Eastern theatres, adding to his reputation and accumulating considerable wealth from the plunder of these campaigns. Harold's tactical approach combined Norse traditions with Byzantine sophistication. From his Norse heritage, he brought the shield wall tactic, the emphasis on personal combat prowess, the willingness to engage in close quarters fighting, where physical strength and courage decided outcomes. From Byzantine service, he learned siege warfare, the use of cavalry in coordination with infantry, naval operations, and the logistical planning required for large-scale campaigns. This combination made him extraordinarily effective as a commander. He was also utterly ruthless. Multiple sources describe Harold using terror as a deliberate tactic, burning towns that resisted him, executing prisoners to discourage further resistance, employing psychological warfare to break enemy morale. This was not unusual for the period. Medieval warfare was brutal by any standard. But even by those standards, Harold seems to have been notably harsh. He calculated that the fear his reputation inspired would make future conquests easier, that enemies who had heard stories of what happened to those who resisted Harold would be more likely to surrender without fighting. His physical courage was undeniable. He fought in the front ranks during assaults, led charges personally, exposed himself to danger in ways that inspired his men, but also risked his life repeatedly. He was wounded several times, though never seriously enough to end his career. Norse culture valued this kind of leadership, the warrior king who fought alongside his men rather than directing from safety, and Harold embodied that ideal. As he gained experience and reputation, Harold rose in the Varangian hierarchy. The exact titles and positions are unclear from sources that were written decades later, but he seems to have commanded significant Varangian forces independently, operating with considerable autonomy in certain campaigns. This was unusual for a foreign mercenary, but Harold's royal birth, his demonstrated competence, and probably his ability to communicate effectively in Greek all contributed to his advancement. He also accumulated enormous wealth. Beyond his regular wages as a guardsman, Harold benefited from the plunder of successful campaigns. Commanders received larger shares of plunder than common soldiers, and Harold made sure to claim his full due. He sent some of this wealth north to Yaroslav in Kiev for safekeeping, establishing a treasury that he would draw on when he eventually returned to claim the Norwegian throne. But he also kept substantial amounts in Constantinople, building the fortune that would make him one of the wealthiest warriors of his generation. His relationship with his fellow Varangians was complex. He was admired for his success and leadership, but also probably resented by some for his ambition and his willingness to take risks with other men's lives. He was Norse like them, but he was also a prince, fundamentally different in his origins and his goals. He would return north eventually to pursue kingship, while most guardsmen hoped only for enough wealth to buy a good farm. This difference must have created some distance, some sense that Harold was using the guard as a stepping stone rather than seeing it as an end in itself. But whatever tensions existed, Harold succeeded in Byzantine service. By the early 1040s, after Christ, he was among the most famous warriors in the empire, his name known not only in Constantinople, but across the Byzantine world and in the Scandinavian lands he had left behind. He had become, in contemporary terms, a legend, a figure whose exploits were already being told in stories that mixed fact and mythology, creating the image of Harald Hardrada as an almost superhuman warrior king. The reality was probably less dramatic, a talented and ruthless commander who combined luck and skill and noble birth to achieve notable success. But the legend was what mattered, and the legend would follow him for the rest of his life and beyond. Love and politics in the Golden City. The sources, particularly the Norse sagas, claim that during his time in Constantinople, Harold fell in love with Maria, a niece of the Empress Zoe. This romantic subplot in Harold's Byzantine service is difficult to verify. The sagas were written long after the events and had incentive to embellish, but it reflects the complicated position Harold occupied at the Byzantine court and the ways personal relationships intersected with political realities. Empress Zoe was one of the most remarkable figures in Byzantine history. She was the daughter of Emperor Constantine VIII, and through her, legitimacy to the throne passed. Byzantine succession law was complex, but imperial blood mattered, and Zoe carried that blood. She had been married 3 times, each marriage effectively making her husband emperor. By the time Harold arrived in Constantinople, Zoe was no longer young. She had been born in 978 after Christ, so she was well into her 50s during Harold's service, but she remained powerful and politically active. If Maria existed and was indeed Zoe's niece, she would have been a member of the imperial family, a woman of high status and considerable worth as a marriage partner. For Harold, an exiled Norwegian prince serving as a foreign mercenary, marriage to such a woman would have been a spectacular elevation, would have connected him permanently to the Byzantine imperial house, and potentially changed his entire trajectory. The saga accounts claim that Harold asked for permission to marry Maria and was refused. The reasons given in the sources vary. Some accounts suggest that the emperor and empress considered Harold, despite his royal Norwegian blood, to be fundamentally a barbarian mercenary beneath the dignity of an imperial marriage. Others suggest that there were political calculations involved, that such a marriage might create complications with Norwegian factions, or might give Harold more prestige than was comfortable for Byzantine authorities. Whether the romantic interest was real or invented by saga writers who wanted to add emotional depth to Harold's story, the broader point is accurate. Harold was in a socially ambiguous position in Constantinople. He was high-born by Norse standards, a prince of the Norwegian royal house, but in Byzantine terms, he was a foreign soldier, someone who served for pay, who lacked the cultural sophistication and family connections that defined true aristocracy in Byzantine eyes. This kind of social ambiguity was common for the Varangian Guard generally. They were well paid, they had access to the palace and to the emperor, they were respected for their martial abilities, but they were not Byzantine nobles. They did not own estates in Anatolia or the Balkans. They did not have intricate family connections to other aristocratic houses. They did not participate in the complex social rituals that defined membership in the Byzantine upper class. They were, in a sense, highly valued outsiders, useful but not fully part of the system. For most guardsmen, this mattered little. They had not come to Constantinople seeking social integration. They wanted gold and glory, and they got both through military service. But for someone like Harold, with royal ambitions and a keen understanding of how power worked, the social barriers must have been frustrating. He could command armies in the emperor's name, could accumulate vast wealth, could earn fame across the empire, but he could not marry into the imperial family, could not transform his military success into the kind of permanent political position that Byzantine nobles held. Harold's time at court, regardless of romantic entanglements, gave him an education in imperial politics. He observed how Byzantine emperors manipulated aristocratic factions, how court ceremonies reinforced hierarchy, how wealth and patronage created networks of obligation. He saw conspiracy and assassination, saw emperors rise and fall, saw the brutal effectiveness of political power when wielded skillfully. All of this he would take back to Norway, applying Byzantine political sophistication to Scandinavian conditions. He also made connections. Some Byzantine officials and aristocrats valued Harold's abilities and cultivated relationships with him. These relationships were typically transactional, based on mutual utility rather than genuine friendship. But they gave Harold allies at court, people who would support his requests, who would speak favourably of him, who would ensure he received appropriate opportunities and rewards. This kind of network building was essential in Byzantine politics, and Harold proved adept at it. The question of marriage and romance aside, Harold's position at court was complicated by his own ambitions. Everyone knew he intended to return north eventually to pursue the Norwegian throne. This made him both useful and potentially dangerous. Useful because his ambitions aligned with Byzantine interests. He wanted wealth and reputation which Byzantine service could provide, and he had no interest in Byzantine dynastic politics, which made him safe as a military commander. Dangerous because he was accumulating resources and reputation that would make him formidable in Scandinavian politics, and if he succeeded in claiming the Norwegian throne, he would be a powerful king with intimate knowledge of Byzantine systems and potential claims on Byzantine attention or support. Byzantine emperors in this period, Michael IV followed by Michael V and then Constantine IX, seem to have handled Harold carefully. They employed him, rewarded him, gave him significant commands. But they also probably watched him, aware that his ultimate loyalties lay elsewhere, that he was using Byzantine service as a means to another end rather than as an end in itself. This was the price of employing ambitious warriors. Men like Harold were effective precisely because they were ambitious, because they cared deeply about reputation and success. But that same ambition meant they would leave eventually, would take what they had learned and earned and apply it elsewhere. For the Byzantine Empire, this was acceptable. The guard was meant to turn over, new warriors replacing those who retired or returned home. As long as Harold served faithfully during his time in Byzantine employ, his eventual departure was not a problem but part of the system's natural functioning. Whether Harold loved Maria, whether she existed at all, or was a saga invention, we cannot know with certainty. What we know is that Harold spent a decade in Constantinople, that he observed and participated in Byzantine court life, that he navigated the complex social and political landscape of the empire with considerable skill, and that in 1042 after Christ, he would make a dramatic departure from Byzantine service, stealing ships and forcing his way out of the city in circumstances that were controversial and spectacular, returning north to begin the final phase of his career that would end at Stamford Bridge 24 years later. The escape. Harold had decided to leave. After nearly a decade in Byzantine service, after campaigns from Sicily to Jerusalem, after accumulating wealth and reputation, he was ready to return north and pursue the Norwegian throne. But leaving Byzantine service was not a simple matter of resigning. There were protocols, permissions required, and Harold either could not wait for those or was refused permission to depart. What happened next became one of the most famous stories in Varangian lore. The year was 1042 after Christ. A new emperor, Constantine IX, had recently come to power through marriage to Empress Zoe. Harold had served under multiple emperors by this point, but his relationship with the new regime was apparently problematic. The sources disagree on exactly why. Some suggest Harold was implicated in some political intrigue. Others claim Constantine was jealous of Harold's reputation or suspicious of his intentions. Still others suggest Harold simply didn't want to wait for formal permission to leave because he knew it might be denied or delayed indefinitely. Harold and his followers, a substantial band of warriors who remained loyal to him personally, made their preparations in secret. They needed ships to leave Constantinople and sail across the Black Sea, up the rivers to Kiev, where Harold had stored much of his accumulated wealth. Simply walking out of the city with his men and their belongings would raise suspicions. He needed to create circumstances that would allow him to depart with his followers and his portable wealth before Byzantine authorities could stop him. The opportunity came during a period when Harold and his men had access to ships, possibly during some military operation or transport duty. The exact circumstances are unclear from sources written decades later, but Harold managed to get his men and a significant amount of treasure aboard several vessels moored in the Golden Horn, the harbour of Constantinople. Then came the problem that made the escape dramatic and nearly impossible. To leave the Golden Horn and reach the Black Sea, ships had to pass through the Bosporus Strait, and at a certain point in the strait, the Byzantines had installed a barrier, a heavy chain stretched across the water from shore to shore, supported by pontoons, designed to prevent unauthorized ships from entering or leaving. This chain could be lowered to allow friendly vessels through, but it was kept raised as a security measure, and lowering it required authorization that Harold certainly did not have. Harold's solution, according to the saga accounts, was audaciously simple and extraordinarily dangerous. He had his men row the ships at full speed toward the chain. As they approached, he ordered everyone to rush to the back of the ships, raising the bows out of the water. The momentum carried the bows up and over the chain. Then, as the centre of the ships reached the chain, Harold ordered everyone to rush forward, raising the sterns and allowing them to clear the chain as the ships pivoted over the obstacle. It was a desperate manoeuvre that could easily have failed. If the timing was wrong, the ships would be caught on the chain, hanging there helplessly until Byzantine authorities arrived. If the ships broke apart from the stress, everyone would be dumped into the water. If they managed to clear the chain but someone was seriously injured, or the ships were too damaged to continue, the escape would end in failure and probably harsh punishment. But according to the sources, it worked. Harold's ships made it over the chain and into the Bosporus proper. One ship, less skillfully managed than Harold's own vessel, got caught on the chain and had to be abandoned, its crew scrambling aboard the other ships. But Harold himself and most of his followers successfully escaped the Golden Horn, sailed through the Bosporus into the Black Sea, and were away before Byzantine forces could organise pursuit. The escape was spectacular, the kind of story that warriors would tell around fires for generations. It combined daring and skill, showed Harold's willingness to take enormous risks, and succeeded despite odds that suggested it should have failed. Whether the details are exactly accurate, or were embellished by saga writers who wanted a dramatic conclusion to Harold's Byzantine service, the core fact seems true. Harold left Constantinople in 1042 after Christ without proper authorization, taking with him his personal followers and substantial wealth, and successfully made his way back north. The escape ended Harold's Byzantine service on a sour note from the empire's perspective. He had stolen ships, had damaged imperial property, had left without permission. Byzantine authorities would have viewed this as betrayal, as violation of his obligations. But from Harold's perspective, and from the perspective of Scandinavian culture that valued boldness and audacity, it was a fitting conclusion to his service. He had taken what he had earned, had outwitted Byzantine attempts to constrain him, and had made his escape in a manner that added to his legendary reputation. He sailed to Kiev, collected the wealth he had stored there with Prince Yaroslav, and spent the next few years building alliances and gathering forces. In 1046 after Christ, he returned to Norway and began the military and political campaigns that would eventually make him king. His decade in Byzantine service had given him the wealth, experience, and reputation he needed. The escape gave him one final story, one last dramatic flourish that embodied the Viking spirit of daring and resourcefulness. For the Varangian Guard, Harold's escape became part of their collective legend. It showed that even the greatest empire could not truly control these northern warriors, that their oaths lasted only as long as they chose to maintain them, that ultimately they answered to their own code and their own ambitions. Future guardsmen would hear the story and feel pride in Harold's audacity, in the way he had used Byzantine service for his own purposes and then departed on his own terms, leaving behind a reputation that would never be forgotten in the halls of Constantinople or in the mead halls of Scandinavia. After the conquest, 24 years after Harald Hardrada's escape from Constantinople in 1066 after Christ, 3 battles in 3 separate kingdoms changed the course of European history. At Stamford Bridge in England, Harald Hardrada was killed trying to conquer the English throne, his decades of success ending in a final defeat. 3 weeks later at Hastings, William of Normandy defeated and killed King Harold Godwinson, conquering England and establishing Norman rule. And in the aftermath of these battles, a new stream of warriors began arriving in Constantinople, refugees from a conquered land seeking service in the Varangian Guard. The English connection to Byzantine service actually predated 1066. There had been occasional English warriors in the Guard before, men who had travelled east for the same reasons Scandinavians did, seeking wealth and adventure. But after the Norman conquest, what had been a trickle became a flood. English noblemen and warriors who refused to accept Norman rule, who had lost their lands and positions, who faced persecution or execution if they remained in England, looked for options. Some fled to Scotland or Ireland, others travelled to Denmark or Norway, and a significant number made the long journey to Constantinople. These English refugees were different from the Norse warriors who had traditionally filled the Varangian Guard. They came not as young men seeking their fortunes, but as dispossessed nobles, men who had held lands and titles, who had fought for their king and lost everything when he fell. They brought with them bitter memories of defeat, hatred of the Normans who had taken their country, and a desperate need for employment that would provide both income and honour. From the Byzantine perspective, these English arrivals were welcome. The Guard needed regular replenishment. Norse recruitment had been declining for various reasons. Changes in Scandinavian society that made Byzantine service less attractive. The development of other opportunities closer to home. The English refugees, many of whom had military experience and noble birth, represented a ready supply of warriors who could maintain the Guard's strength. The English brought their own military traditions. They were accustomed to fighting in shield walls, like the Norse, but their equipment and tactics had developed somewhat differently. They favoured axes, but also used swords and spears, wore mail armour similar to what the Norse used, and fought with a discipline that came from England's relatively organised military system. They were Christian, Orthodox after conversion, if they weren't already, and they had no connection to Byzantine politics that might compromise their loyalty. But they also brought complications. The most significant was their relationship with the Norse, who still formed a substantial portion of the Guard. Vikings had raided England for generations. The Danish conquest of England in the early 11th century was still within living memory. English and Norse had been enemies far more often than allies. Now they were expected to serve together in the same unit, to fight side by side, to maintain the Varangian Guard's reputation for cohesion and loyalty. To the credit of both groups, they managed this transition with less conflict than might have been expected. Part of this was simple necessity. Both English and Norse in Constantinople were far from home, surrounded by a foreign culture, dependent on the Guard for their livelihoods. They had common interests that outweighed old enmities. Part of it was the Guard's institutional culture, the emphasis on oath-keeping and brotherhood that transcended national origins. And part of it was probably Byzantine management, officers who worked to integrate the new English recruits while maintaining the Guard's cohesion. Over time, the English component of the Guard grew until it equalled or exceeded the Norse. By the late 11th century after Christ, the Varangian Guard was perhaps more accurately described as Anglo-Norse rather than purely Norse. The name Varangian remained, the traditions and reputation persisted, but the composition had evolved. English words began to mix with Norse in the Guard's internal vocabulary. English saints were venerated alongside Norse ones in the Guard's prayers. The culture became hybrid, neither purely English nor Norse, but something new. This transformation was gradual, occurring over decades rather than happening overnight. But by the end of the 11th century, the Varangian Guard that stood watch in the Great Palace included substantial numbers of English warriors, whose fathers or grandfathers had fought at Hastings, who carried memories of a lost homeland, who saw their service in Constantinople as both exile and opportunity. The story of the Guard's evolution, from Norse to Anglo-Norse, was a story of adaptation and resilience. The institution survived not by remaining static, but by accepting new recruits who brought different traditions while maintaining the core values that made the Guard valuable. The oath remained central, the reputation for loyalty persisted, the military effectiveness continued, but the Guard was changing, slowly but inevitably, shaped by the larger historical forces that sent displaced English warriors eastward to serve a Greek emperor in a city few of them had ever expected to see. The English axes. The English warriors who joined the Varangian Guard in the decades after 1066 brought with them a distinct character that both complemented and contrasted with the Norse traditions of the Guard. They were refugees, but also warriors, defeated but not broken, men who had lost one kingdom and found service in another. Many of these English guardsmen came from the nobility. They had been negnes, men who held land directly from the king, who had military obligations and aristocratic status in Anglo-Saxon England. The Norman conquest had stripped them of their lands and positions. Some had fought at Hastings or in the rebellions that followed. Others had submitted to Norman rule initially, but found it intolerable, the loss of status and autonomy too great to accept. For these men, going into exile and taking service with the Byzantine emperor was not a descent into mercenary work, but a continuation of their warrior identity in a different context. The English brought literary and educational backgrounds that were often more developed than those of Norse warriors. Anglo-Saxon England had been highly literate by medieval standards. Many English nobles could read and write, were familiar with Latin and English literature, had been educated in monastic schools or royal courts. This literary culture came with them to Constantinople. English guardsmen could serve as scribes and translators, could read Byzantine documents, could participate in the sophisticated literary culture of the empire in ways that purely Norse warriors often couldn't. They also brought a particular military tradition. English warfare had emphasized the shield wall, like Norse warfare, but had developed its own variations. The English Varangians fought primarily on foot, forming dense formations that relied on discipline and cohesion. They used axes famously, the great two-handed axes that had been devastatingly effective when properly wielded. But they also used swords and spears, were comfortable with various weapons depending on circumstances. The famous Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was maintained until the middle of the 12th century after Christ, includes mentions of Englishmen going east to serve the Emperor of Constantinople. These mentions are brief. The chroniclers were primarily concerned with events in England, but they confirm that contemporaries understood this migration as significant, that going to Constantinople was a recognized option for displaced English warriors. In Constantinople itself, the English guardsmen formed their own sub-community within the larger Varangian brotherhood. They maintained English language and customs, celebrated English saints' days, told stories about the old country and the battles they had fought. But they also integrated with the Norse, learned Norse words and customs, married Norse women or Byzantine women, created hybrid identities that drew from multiple traditions. The relationship between English and Norse in the Guard was not always smooth. Old enmities occasionally surfaced, disputes over precedence or honour or the proper way to do things. The Guard's commanders had to mediate these conflicts to remind all guardsmen that they served the Emperor together, that internal divisions weakened the unit's effectiveness. But generally, the English and Norse coexisted successfully, united by their common status as foreigners in Byzantine service, by their shared oath to the Emperor, by the military brotherhood that developed among men who fought together. The English influence gradually changed certain aspects of Varangian culture, the Guard's Christianity, which had always been present, but perhaps somewhat superficial, for many Norse warriors, who retained pagan sympathies, became more pronounced with the arrival of English guardsmen who were thoroughly Christianized. The Guard's participation in Orthodox liturgy became more elaborate. English guardsmen brought Anglo-Saxon religious practices that merged with Orthodox traditions, creating hybrid devotional forms. The Guard's language became more complex as well. Old Norse had been the primary language, with Greek learned as necessary for dealing with Byzantine authorities. Now English was added to the mix. Some guardsmen became trilingual, speaking Norse and English and Greek with varying degrees of fluency. This linguistic diversity actually proved useful, as English guardsmen could serve as intermediaries in contexts where Norse warriors struggled with language barriers. English guardsmen also brought different attitudes toward wealth and status. Many had been wealthy in England, had owned estates, and commanded retinues. They viewed Byzantine service as a step down from what they had lost, but also as the best available option given circumstances. This was different from Norse warriors, who often came from modest backgrounds and saw Byzantine service as a step up, a path to wealth they could never have achieved at home. These different perspectives sometimes created tension, but also enriched the Guard's culture, bringing multiple viewpoints to questions of honour and service and identity. By the early 12th century after Christ, the Varangian Guard was thoroughly Anglo-Norse in composition. The institution had successfully absorbed a major influx of new recruits from a different culture and had emerged stronger rather than fractured. The Guard's reputation remained intact, its military effectiveness undiminished, its loyalty to the Emperor unwavering. The axes that guarded the Byzantine Emperor were now swung by English hands, as often as Norse hands, but they were still Varangian axes, still the symbol of foreign warriors who had sworn oaths and who maintained those oaths regardless of their origins. This successful integration of English warriors into a primarily Norse institution demonstrated the Varangian Guard's adaptability and resilience. The Guard was not frozen in time, unchanged since Basil II's era. It evolved as circumstances required, accepting new members who brought different traditions, incorporating those traditions while maintaining core identity. This ability to change while preserving essential character would help the Guard survive for another 2 centuries, long after one might have expected such an institution to disappear or lose its distinctive nature. You hear Mass in Hagia Sophia. You stand in Hagia Sophia, and you are very far from Thor's halls. The church surrounds you, like a cave made of light. The dome soars overhead, so high that you cannot judge the distance, floating on golden light that pours through the ring of windows at its base. The architects who built this place intended it to inspire awe, to create a space that felt more like heaven than earth. And in this they succeeded absolutely. Even after years of seeing this place, of attending services here as your duty requires, you still cannot quite believe humans made this. The liturgy is beginning. The priests process through the nave, their robes catching lamplight, swinging censers that fill the air with smoke that smells of frankincense and myrrh, scents that have become permanently associated in your mind with Byzantine Christianity. The smoke drifts upward, visible in the beams of light from the windows, rising toward the dome, where Christ Pantocrator looks down with a face that is simultaneously stern and loving, judging and merciful. The choir begins to sing, voices rising in harmonies that sound nothing like the songs you learned as a child. This is Byzantine chant, solemn and complex, the kind of music that seems designed to lift the soul out of the body, to create acoustic space that mirrors the physical space of the church. The sound echoes off marble walls, multiplies in the vast volume of the dome, becomes something more than human voices singing, becomes something that feels divine. You are in full uniform, your mail shirt polished, your axe held in the proper position. You stand with other guardsmen, stationed around the church to protect the emperor who kneels near the altar and to maintain order among the congregation. But protection is not really needed here. Hagia Sophia is sacred ground, and even the most ambitious conspirator would hesitate to profane it with violence. Your presence is more symbolic than practical, a reminder that imperial power extends even into this most holy space. The smell is overwhelming. Incense, yes, but also lamp oil burning in hundreds of vessels, the particular scent of old stone and ancient mosaics, the faint smell of the enormous crowd gathered for this service. Thousands of people, creating a warmth that fights against the church's natural coolness. You breathe it all in, this olfactory signature of Byzantine worship, so different from the sharp, clean air of the north. The mosaics on the walls catch light and seem to move. The Virgin Mary holds the Christ child, her face sad and knowing, saints gesture with hands raised in blessing, or holding scrolls with scripture. Angels hover in the pendentives, beneath the dome, wings spread, faces serene. All of this is golden-coloured glass, tiny pieces arranged with impossible precision, creating images that glow as if lit from within. You think about the gods your grandfather worshipped. Odin, the Allfather, who traded an eye for wisdom, Thor with his hammer, bringer of thunder, Freya, who claimed half the slain warriors. Your grandfather believed in those gods, absolutely made offerings to them, called on them in battle. You were baptized Christian before you came south, a practical conversion that secured employment. But the old gods still live in the back of your mind, still form part of how you understand the world. Standing here, listening to the liturgy that you don't fully understand, Latin and Greek mixed together in prayers, whose meanings you only partially grasp, you wonder what Thor would make of this place. This is power, certainly, but it's not the kind of power Thor represents. This is something subtle and overwhelming at once, an expression of divine majesty that works through beauty and terror combined, that makes you feel small and significant simultaneously. The priest raises the consecrated bread and wine, the body and blood of Christ according to doctrine. The emperor prostrates himself, as do the nobility and congregation. Even you, standing guard, bow your head in respect if not full comprehension. This is the mystery at the heart of Christianity, the transformation of ordinary things into sacred through ritual and belief. You remain standing through the long service, your legs growing tired, your back aching from the weight of mail, but you give no sign of discomfort. This is part of your duty, part of what your oath demands. You will stand here until the service ends, whether that takes 1 hour or 3, and you will do it without complaint, because you are Varangian, and Varangians do not falter in their duty. The light shifts as the service continues, sun moving across the sky outside, changing the patterns on the walls, creating new shadows and highlights. Hagia Sophia is never static, never the same from 1 hour to the next. The architects understood light, understood how to make a building that seemed alive, that changed with time and season while remaining fundamentally itself. As the liturgy reaches its conclusion, as the final prayers are said and the congregation begins to disperse, you allow yourself a moment of reflection. You have stood guard in this church dozens of times. You have listened to these chants, smelled this incense, watched these rituals until they have become familiar, despite remaining foreign. You are Christian now, at least nominally, at least sufficiently to fulfill requirements. Whether you believe in the way the priests want you to believe, whether your soul has truly converted, or only your outward behavior, that is between you and whatever gods watch over warriors who serve far from home. You file out with the other guardsmen, your watch here complete. Outside, Constantinople bustles with afternoon life, markets and merchants, beggars and nobles, the eternal noise of the greatest city in the world. But inside, for a moment longer, the incense lingers. The light continues to transform stone into something that feels like heaven, and the mystery of this strange faith that rules this strange empire continues its eternal liturgy, unchanged by your presence or absence, indifferent to your doubts, magnificent in its certainty. The Crusader Kings. The relationship between the Varangian Guard and the Crusaders who began arriving in the Byzantine Empire at the end of the 11th century, after Christ, was complicated. From the start, coloured by mutual suspicion, cultural misunderstanding, and occasionally open conflict, the First Crusade, which began in 1096, brought thousands of Western European warriors to Constantinople, men who claimed to be fighting for Christ, but who represented potential threats to Byzantine security and interests. The Crusaders were primarily French and Norman, with contingents from other Western European regions. Many came from the very Norman kingdom that had conquered England, the homeland that English Varangians had fled. For English guardsmen, watching Norman knights parade through Constantinople must have stirred bitter memories of Hastings and its aftermath, of lost lands and dead comrades. The Varangians were expected to help manage these crusaders, to ensure they didn't threaten Constantinople itself, even while maintaining cordial relations with warriors who might have been enemies in other contexts. Emperor Alexios I Komnenos, who ruled during the First Crusade, used the Varangian Guard extensively in his dealings with the Crusaders. The guardsmen served as visible symbols of imperial power when Crusader leaders came to the palace to swear oaths to the emperor. They stood watch during negotiations, their axes and stern northern faces reminding these Western warriors that the Byzantine emperor commanded forces that should not be trifled with. They also participated in military operations alongside Crusader contingents, though often with tension and distrust on both sides. The cultural differences were profound. The Crusaders were Latin Christians who acknowledged the Pope in Rome, while the Byzantines and their Varangian guardsmen followed Orthodox Christianity centered on the Patriarch of Constantinople. This religious divide, which had been formalized in the Great Schism of 1054, created friction, even among people who theoretically worshipped the same god. The Crusaders viewed the Byzantines as schismatics, possibly even heretics. The Byzantines saw the Crusaders as crude barbarians who misunderstood both Christianity and civilized behavior. Beyond religion, there were practical conflicts. The Crusaders wanted to conquer territory in the Holy Land to establish their own kingdoms and principalities. The Byzantines wanted to use the crusade to reclaim lost imperial territories, to restore Byzantine control over lands that had been lost to Arab and Turkish forces. These goals were not necessarily compatible, and as the crusade progressed, tensions increased when Crusader leaders established independent states rather than returning conquered lands to Byzantine authority. The most direct military conflict between the Varangian Guard and Crusader forces came at the Battle of Dyrrhachium in 1081, actually before the First Crusade proper, but during Norman expansion into Byzantine territories. Robert Guiscard, the Norman duke who had conquered much of southern Italy, brought his forces across the Adriatic to attack Byzantine holdings in what is now Albania and Greece. His son Bohemond, who would later become a prominent Crusader leader, fought in this campaign. At Dyrrhachium, Byzantine forces, including a strong Varangian contingent, faced the Norman army. The battle was hard fought and ultimately a Byzantine defeat, but the Varangian Guard distinguished itself through desperate fighting. The guardsmen formed the core of the Byzantine centre, holding their position even as other units broke and fled. They fought with their characteristic discipline and ferocity, their axes cutting down Norman knights, whose heavy cavalry usually dominated medieval battlefields. But courage was not enough. The Normans were simply too strong, their tactics too effective. The Byzantine army was routed, and the Varangians had to retreat along with everyone else. Many guardsmen died in the battle or in the retreat that followed. It was one of the Guard's most costly engagements, a reminder that even the most loyal and well-trained troops could not overcome strategic and tactical disadvantages. For English Varangians, fighting Normans at Dyrrhachium must have carried extra weight. These were the conquerors of England, the men who had taken their homeland. Here was a chance for revenge, even if indirect, even if 15 years after Hastings. Some English guardsmen surely fought with particular fury, seeing in each Norman knight a symbol of everything they had lost. Whether that fury translated into effectiveness or simply into more casualties is impossible to say from sources that give us only the bare outline of events. The relationship with Crusaders remained tense through the next decades. During the Second Crusade, in the middle of the 12th century after Christ, more Western warriors passed through Constantinople, and again there were incidents of violence and theft, of Crusaders behaving badly in Byzantine territory, of Byzantine authorities, including the Varangian Guard, having to maintain order. The Guard served as police, as often as soldiers during these periods, breaking up fights, protecting Byzantine citizens from Crusader excesses, ensuring that the city was not damaged by the very warriors who claimed to be defending Christianity. There were also individual friendships and alliances. Not all interactions between Varangians and Crusaders were hostile. Some Crusader knights respected the Guard's military reputation and sought to learn from them. Some guardsmen were impressed by the elaborate armour and training of Western knights. Trade and exchange happened, sharing of weapons and techniques, occasional cooperation in military operations where goals aligned, but these positive interactions occurred against a background of fundamental tension. The Guard's role during the Crusader period was to protect Byzantine interests, while managing warriors who were theoretically allies, but often behaved like threats. It was delicate work, requiring political sophistication alongside military readiness. The guardsmen had to know when to be intimidating and when to be diplomatic, when to use force and when to show restraint, that they generally succeeded. That Constantinople was not sacked by Crusaders during the First or Second Crusades. owed something to the Varangian Guard's effectiveness in this complex role. But the Guard could not prevent everything. The tensions that built during the Crusades, the mutual distrust between Latins and Greeks, between Western and Eastern Christianity, would eventually explode in the catastrophe of the Fourth Crusade. That disaster, which would bring the Varangian Guard to one of its finest and most tragic moments, was still decades away as the 12th century after Christ progressed. For now, the Guard continued its service, adapting to new challenges, maintaining traditions, even as the world around it changed in ways that no one fully understood or controlled. 49 years. His name was Orm, and he had been in Constantinople for 49 years. He had arrived as a young warrior, 20 years old, fresh from England, with memories of the conquest still raw. Now he was 69, an old man by any standard, still serving though his duties had become lighter, more ceremonial than active. Orm could remember when he had climbed walls at sieges, when his arms had been strong enough to swing an axe through hours of battle without tiring. He remembered campaigns in the Balkans, winter marches through mountains, sleeping on frozen ground, and waking to fight before dawn. He remembered friends who had died in battle, or from disease, who had drunk bad water, or taken wounds that festered. He remembered sending gold home to England, to a family he had not seen in decades, to a brother he would never see again, because that brother had died 15 years ago, and Orm had only learned about it through a letter that took months to arrive. He sat now in the barracks common room, his old body grateful for the bench and the spring sunshine that came through the windows. His hands, scarred and twisted with the arthritis that came to warriors who had gripped weapons for too many years, rested on his knees. He wore the uniform still, though his mail shirt was lighter than what active guardsmen wore, a concession to his age and to the reduced duties he performed. The younger guardsmen treated him with respect. He was a link to the past, a man who had served under emperors whose names were now history. He had stood guard during the First Crusade, had seen the Crusader armies pass through Constantinople. He had fought at Dyrrhachium, though he rarely spoke of that defeat. He had accumulated more memories than any man should have to carry, had outlived 2 generations of fellow guardsmen. Orm thought about retirement often. His service was officially complete, had been for years. He could claim his accumulated pay, could take the palace plundering privilege he had earned through decades of loyalty, could book passage on a ship heading north. But to where? England was no longer his home, if it ever had been. He had no family there now, no land, no connections. The England he remembered, Anglo-Saxon England before the Normans, was gone. Even if he returned, he would find only strangers and Norman lords, and a landscape that bore his homeland's name but not its character. So he stayed. Constantinople had become his home in ways he had not intended, but could not deny. He knew its streets and its seasons. He knew the smell of the markets and the sound of the church bells. He knew which vendors in the tavern district watered their wine, and which didn't. He knew Greek better than he remembered English, thought in Greek sometimes, dreamed in a mixture of languages that belonged to no single country. He had a woman, a Greek widow he had known for 20 years. They had never married. The complications seemed too great, but they lived together in a comfortable arrangement that suited them both. She cooked for him, mended his clothes, listened to his stories, even though she had heard them all many times before. He gave her the respect and protection that came with being associated with a Varangian, even an old one. It was not the life either had imagined in youth, but it was a good life, peaceful and sufficient. Sometimes at night, Orm would think about the farm where he had been born. He could still picture it, the fields and the small house, the way morning mist rose from the river in autumn. He could remember his mother's face, his father's voice. But they were like dreams now, images from another life, from a person who was not quite him anymore. That young English Thegnu who had fled the Normans, who had travelled east, seeking revenge or glory or simply survival. He had died somewhere along the way. The man who remained was something else, neither English nor Byzantine but a hybrid, a man between worlds who belonged fully to neither. Orm knew he would die in Constantinople. He would not see England again, would not be buried in English earth beside his ancestors. He would die here, in this foreign city that had become home, and some younger guardsman would inherit his duties and his place. His woman would mourn him, perhaps, and then she would find another arrangement, because that was how life worked. The guard would continue without him, as it had continued without all the thousands who had served before him, and as it would continue without all those who served now. He felt no bitterness about this. 49 years was enough time to make peace with his choices. He had served with honour. He had kept his oath. He had seen wonders that few men from his village could have imagined. He had stood in the great palace and guarded emperors, had fought in battles that mattered, had earned gold and respect, and a kind of immortality through service. When he died, his name would be recorded in the guards' rolls, would be remembered in the prayers said for fallen guardsmen. It was enough. It had to be enough. And on days like this, sitting in spring sunshine with old bones at rest, it felt like enough, felt like more than enough, felt like a full life well lived, even if it had been lived far from home and far from everything he had once expected. The Fourth Crusade. In the spring of 1204 after Christ, an event occurred that would haunt Byzantine memory for centuries, and that would mark the beginning of the end for the Varangian Guard, as it had existed for more than 200 years. The Fourth Crusade, which had been intended to liberate Jerusalem from Muslim control, instead turned its attention to Constantinople itself, and the Varangians, who had guarded the city through wars and intrigues and political upheavals, faced their greatest and most tragic test. The Fourth Crusade had been troubled from its inception. The Crusaders, mostly French and Italian, had contracted with Venice for ships to transport them to Egypt, which they intended to attack as a staging ground for operations against the Holy Land. But they could not pay the full amount they had agreed, and the Venetians demanded alternative compensation. What followed was a series of decisions that led the crusade away from its stated purpose. The Crusaders attacked Zara, a Christian city on the Adriatic coast that was under Hungarian protection, to satisfy Venetian commercial interests. This action was so clearly contrary to crusading principles that Pope Innocent III excommunicated the entire crusading army, though he later partially lifted the excommunication. Then a Byzantine prince named Alexios, son of the deposed Emperor Isaac II, approached the Crusaders with an offer. If they would help him reclaim the throne, he would pay them handsomely, provide supplies for their expedition, and bring the Byzantine Church under papal authority. The Crusaders agreed. They sailed to Constantinople in 1203, and their presence outside the walls was enough to cause political upheaval. Emperor Alexios III fled, and Isaac II was restored to power with his son Alexios as co-emperor. But the promised payments never fully materialized. Byzantine politics being as complicated as always, and tensions between the Crusaders, camped outside the walls, and the Byzantine population inside grew increasingly dangerous. In April of 1204, the situation exploded. Anti-Latin sentiment in Constantinople had been building for decades. Resentment of Western traders and warriors, who seemed arrogant and grasping. Now a mob killed some Crusaders who had entered the city, and the Crusaders, angry and feeling betrayed by the Byzantine leadership's failure to deliver promised payments, decided to take what they were owed by force. The attack on Constantinople by Crusader forces was one of history's great betrayals. These were men who claimed to be warriors of Christ, who had taken vows to fight for the faith, now attacking the greatest Christian city in the world. The Byzantines, who had dealt with the Crusades for over a century, who had provided supplies and guidance and military support, now faced siege by the very warriors they had tried to help. The Varangian Guard, which numbered perhaps 1,000 men at this point, took its position on the walls. The Guard had guarded emperors through coups and rebellions. It had fought in countless battles across the empire, but it had never faced a threat quite like this. The Crusaders had siege equipment, had experience from years of warfare, had numbers that dwarfed the defenders' available forces. Constantinople's walls were the strongest in the world. Triple fortifications that had never been breached by external enemies, but they required enough defenders to man them properly. The first assault failed. The Crusaders attacked on April 9th, and Byzantine defenders, including the Varangian contingent, held them off. But the Crusaders regrouped and attacked again on April 12th. This time, they brought their ships close to the walls, using flying bridges from ship masts to reach the battlements. It was a desperate and ingenious tactic, and it worked. The Varangians fought on the walls, where the Crusaders gained footholds. The sources, primarily written by Crusaders who were not sympathetic to their enemies, still mention the fierce resistance offered by the Northern Guardsmen. These were old traditions being defended, oaths being kept even when hope was fading. The Guardsmen wielded their axes against knights in full armour, fought in the close quarters of wall walks and towers, died in numbers that would end the Guard as an effective military force. But they could not stop what was happening. Too many Crusaders, too few defenders, too much confusion as the Byzantine leadership collapsed, and different factions fought or fled or tried to negotiate. By the end of April 12th, the Crusaders controlled significant portions of the city. The emperor and what remained of the government had fled. Constantinople, which had stood for nearly 900 years as the capital of the Roman Empire in the east, had fallen to Latin Christians who were supposed to be allies. What followed was catastrophe. The Crusaders sacked Constantinople for 3 days. They looted churches and palaces, stole relics and treasures, destroyed art that was irreplaceable. They violated the sanctity of Hagia Sophia, using it as a stable and breaking up its altar for the precious metals. They burned sections of the city, killing civilians, committing atrocities that shocked even medieval observers who were accustomed to war's cruelties. It was one of history's great cultural destructions, a civilizational wound that never fully healed. The Varangian Guard, those who survived the fighting on the walls, scattered. Some may have died in the chaos of the sack, others fled with the Byzantine government in exile, which established itself in Nicaea, in Asia Minor, and would eventually retake Constantinople in 1261. Still others simply melted away. Warriors whose oaths had been to an empire that no longer existed in its old form, who faced impossible choices about what loyalty meant when the institution they served had been destroyed. The Fourth Crusade marked the effective end of the Varangian Guard as a major military force. The Guard would continue to exist in some form after Constantinople was retaken by Byzantine forces, but it would never again be what it had been. The wealth was gone, looted by the Crusaders. The continuity of tradition was broken. The empire itself was diminished, impoverished, unable to maintain expensive foreign troops at previous levels. The Golden Age was over, ended not by gradual decline but by sudden catastrophe, whispers and embers. After the storm came a strange quiet. Constantinople under Latin rule, the emperors who called themselves rulers of Romania, but were really just French and Italian nobles, dividing Byzantine territories among themselves. The palace occupied by Western lords who did not understand its history or respect its traditions. The churches converted to Latin Rite, their orthodox practices suppressed or driven underground. The Varangian Guard in this period became a ghost of itself. Some guardsmen remained, attaching themselves to the Byzantine government in exile in Nicaea. Others found employment with the Latin emperors, who recognized that having a guard with the Varangian name carried prestige, even if the reality no longer matched the legend. Still others simply disappeared from the historical record, warriors who retired or died or found other employment, whose stories ended without being recorded. In Nicaea, The court in exile maintained a small Varangian contingent. These were guardsmen who had fled Constantinople with the imperial family, who chose loyalty to the Byzantine tradition over accommodation with the Latin conquerors. They served the Nicaean emperors with the same oath-bound fidelity their predecessors had shown, but they did so in reduced circumstances. Nicaea was not Constantinople. It was a provincial city, lacking the wealth and grandeur and cultural richness of the capital. The Varangian Guard, there was a shadow, a remembrance of former glory. Recruitment became difficult. The pipeline of warriors from Scandinavia and England that had sustained the Guard for 2 centuries had largely dried up. Scandinavian society had changed. Christianity was now well established in the north, and with it came different attitudes toward warrior service. The kind of young man who in earlier generations would have travelled to Constantinople, seeking glory now, might enter a monastery or join a crusade, or simply stay home and farm. England, under Norman rule, had its own military traditions and opportunities. The steady stream of warriors heading east had slowed to a trickle. The guard that remained was increasingly made up of sons and grandsons of earlier guardsmen, men born in Constantinople or in Byzantine territories who had Scandinavian or English ancestry, but who were really Byzantine in culture. They maintained some traditions, the axes and the name, but they were no longer quite the foreign warriors that the original guard had been. They were hybrid, between cultures, representing a history that was passing. The reconquest of Constantinople in 1261 by Byzantine forces from Nicaea brought the Guard back to the capital, but it was not a restoration of the old order. The city had been damaged, its population reduced, its wealth looted. The empire itself was a fraction of its former size, squeezed between Latin principalities in Greece, Turkish emirates in Anatolia, and the growing power of Genoa and Venice at sea. There was no money for expensive foreign troops. There was barely money to maintain the army at all. The Varangian Guard continued nominally, appearing in court records and ceremonial descriptions, but its military function declined. It became increasingly ceremonial, guardsmen who stood in the palace and participated in imperial rituals, but who were not deployed on campaigns, who were not the emperor's elite shock troops that they had once been. The tradition persisted, but the substance faded, until finally, sometime in the 14th century after Christ, the records simply stopped mentioning the Varangian Guard. The institution that had lasted for more than 3 centuries came to an end, not dramatically, but through quiet obsolescence. You watch the sun set over the Golden Horn. You are old now, and this will be your last sunset in Constantinople. You stand on a terrace overlooking the Golden Horn, the great harbour where ships from every corner of the world have docked for centuries. The light is golden, appropriately, the late afternoon sun painting the water with copper and amber, turning the distant hills of Galata into layers of purple and grey. The city around you hums with its eternal noise, but up here there is a strange quiet, a pocket of stillness in the midst of movement. 40 years you have been here. You arrived as a young warrior, hungry for glory and gold, and you stayed because staying seemed easier than leaving, because Constantinople became home in ways you never expected. The Guard you joined is not what it was when you arrived, and the Guard you leave behind is lesser still. But you served. You kept your oath. That is enough. You think about the first time you saw this harbour, sailing in on a merchant ship from the north, passing through the Bosporus, and rounding into the Golden Horn, with Constantinople spreading before you in impossible magnificence. You were terrified and excited and overwhelmed. The city seemed like something from a dream, buildings rising in tiers, walls that stretched forever, ships of every description crowding the harbour. You could not imagine how humans had built such a place. You cannot imagine it now, even after living here for decades. The call to evening prayer drifts across the city, bells from dozens of churches marking the day's end. You have heard these bells 10,000 times. have learned to tell churches apart by the sound of their bells, have found comfort in this daily rhythm that marks time in sacred intervals. You were baptized Christian before you came here, but Constantinople taught you what Christianity could be, showed you a faith that built Hagia Sophia, and created liturgies of impossible beauty. Your hand rests on the terrace railing, and you notice how old it looks. When did your hand become an old man's hand? Spotted and weathered and marked by scars from decades of service. You do not feel old inside, but your body tells a different story. The aches that you wake with now, the stiffness that never quite leaves, the way stairs have become challenging. Your body is ready to retire, even if your spirit is not. Tomorrow you leave. You have booked passage on a ship heading north, carrying goods to the Black Sea ports, and from there, up the rivers, toward Kiev and beyond. You will retrace the journey you made 4 decades ago, but in reverse, moving away from this city that has been your home and your prison and your purpose. You are going home, though home is a place you barely remember, a land that has changed as much as you have changed. You have gold, more gold than you ever dreamed of as a young warrior. The palace plundering when the last emperor you served died was generous. Your accumulated wages, carefully saved over decades, would make you wealthy by northern standards. You will buy land, will live comfortably for whatever years remain to you. This was always the plan, always the goal. Serve faithfully, accumulate wealth, return home, rich and honoured. But standing here watching the sunset, you feel something unexpected. Not joy at leaving, not relief that service is ending, but sadness, grief even. You are leaving behind 40 years of life, friends who have become brothers, a city that you know in ways you will never know any other place. You speak Greek better than your native tongue now. You think in Byzantine terms about politics and culture. You have become something other than what you were. And leaving means abandoning that self, becoming someone else again. The sun touches the horizon, and the light shifts, becomes softer and redder. Shadows lengthen across the harbour. The ships at anchor become silhouettes, their details dissolving into simple shapes against the glowing water. Somewhere in the city, lamps are being lit. Evening markets are opening. The nightlife of Constantinople is beginning its eternal cycle. You will remember this moment, years from now, living on whatever farm you buy in whatever northern land will take you. You will remember standing here on this terrace, watching the sun set over the Golden Horn. You will remember the smell of the harbour, salt water, and tar and spices from the cargo ships. You will remember the sound of the bells. You will remember how the light made everything beautiful, even the scars and damage that marked this city that had been sacked and conquered, and yet somehow endured. A younger guardsman approaches, one you have trained, and asks if you need anything. You shake your head, smile, send him away. You want this moment alone, this last sunset, this final evening in the city that shaped you. Tomorrow you will be a different person, an old warrior returning home. But tonight, for a few more hours, you are still Varangian. You still belong to Constantinople. The oath that has defined your adult life is still active, still binding, still the core of who you are. The sun disappears below the horizon. The light fades quickly now, twilight coming on fast. You turn from the terrace and walk slowly back into the palace, back to the barracks where you will spend your final night. Behind you, Constantinople continues its eternal existence, indifferent to your departure, enduring as it always endures. Tomorrow you will be gone, but the city will remain, and somewhere in its records, your name will persist. One guardsman among thousands, one warrior who came from the north and served and eventually went home, carrying with him memories of marble and gold and the weight of oaths kept faithfully to the end. The last axes. The final mentions of the Varangian Guard in Byzantine sources come from the 14th century after Christ scattered references that suggest the institution continued in some form but had lost most of its military significance. By this late period, the Byzantine Empire itself was in terminal decline, squeezed between the expanding Ottoman Empire in the east and various Italian maritime powers in the west. The empire, that had once stretched from Spain to Mesopotamia, was reduced to Constantinople and some surrounding territories, impoverished and increasingly irrelevant in the geopolitics of the late medieval world. The guard in this period was ceremonial more than martial. Guardsmen appeared at imperial coronations and important religious festivals, standing in their traditional positions with their axes, maintaining the forms even as the substance had long since evaporated. They were symbols, reminders of past glory, visual connections to a history that stretched back centuries. But they were no longer the elite fighting force that had held the line at Abydos or fought on the walls against the Fourth Crusade. The composition had changed completely. There were probably no longer any warriors coming from Scandinavia. England had been under various rulers for generations, and its connection to the Byzantine tradition had long since faded. The men who called themselves Varangians in the 14th century were likely descendants of earlier guardsmen, families that had been in Constantinople for generations who maintained the tradition as a kind of hereditary position. They spoke Greek as their first language, married Greek women, were Byzantine in all but name and official designation. The last clear historical mention of the Varangian Guard comes from around 1340, though the exact date is uncertain. By this time, Emperor John V Palaeologos ruled an empire that was more fiction than reality, heavily indebted to Italian bankers, militarily impotent, culturally magnificent but politically irrelevant. The guard that served him bore little resemblance to the warriors who had served Basil II. They were palace servants who happened to carry axes, ceremonial figures whose ancestors had once been fearsome warriors. After 1340, the references simply stop. The guard is not mentioned in accounts of imperial ceremonies or military operations. It appears to have simply faded away, abolished formally, or more likely just allowed to disappear through attrition and irrelevance. As guardsmen died or retired, they were not replaced. The institution that no one bothered to end officially ceased to exist when the last man who called himself Varangian put down his axe for the final time. Constantinople itself would fall in 1453 to Ottoman Turkish forces under Sultan Mehmed II. The final siege of the Byzantine capital was desperate, heroic, and ultimately hopeless. The walls that had protected the city for 1,000 years were finally breached by Ottoman artillery. Emperor Constantine XI died fighting in the streets, and the Byzantine Empire came to its definitive end. In that final siege, there were no Varangians. The guard that had been formed to protect emperors was gone more than a century before the last emperor fell. The ending was quiet, almost invisible. No dramatic final stand, no last battle where the guard died to the last man protecting their emperor. Just a gradual fading, a slow decline that mirrored the empire's own descent from glory to irrelevance. Men stopped coming from the north. The gold that had paid generous wages disappeared as the empire impoverished. The need for foreign bodyguards became less pressing when there was little left to guard. And so the institution that had lasted for more than 350 years simply ended, not with thunder, but with silence. The axes were put aside. The oaths were no longer sworn. The tradition that had connected Constantinople to the distant north, that had brought thousands of warriors over centuries to serve in the great palace, came to its conclusion. The Varangian Guard passed from living institution into history, into legend, into the stories that would be told for centuries about the northern warriors who guarded Byzantine emperors with a loyalty that could not be bought, broken, or corrupted. In some archive, in some dusty record that survived the Ottoman conquest and the centuries that followed, the names remain. lists of guardsmen, their origins when known, their years of service, their fates if recorded. Thousands of names, most now meaningless, a few still recognizable. Harald Hardrada is there somewhere, the most famous Varangian, the warrior king whose decade of service became legendary. But also thousands of others, Bjorns and Kalfs and Orms, English Thegners and Norse farmers' sons, men whose names are recorded, but whose stories are lost, who came to Constantinople seeking gold and glory, and who found both, along with everything that came with service, in the most sophisticated empire of the medieval world. They are gone now, all of them, the men who stood watch in the great palace, who fought in battles from Sicily to Syria, who kept oaths, even when doing so required sacrifice and suffering. They died centuries ago, and their bones are dust. But the record of their service remains, preserved in chronicles and documents, in Norse sagas and Byzantine histories, in archaeological evidence, and in the collective memory of cultures that they connected through their service. The Varangian Guard has ended, but the legend of the Guard endures, will endure as long as people remember the story of warriors who came from the frozen north to guard emperors in a city of gold. Returning north, picture a ship on the Black Sea in late summer, sailing north toward the river mouths, carrying men who are going home. The vessel is not large, a merchant ship primarily, carrying Byzantine goods to trade in the northern markets. But it also carries passengers, half a dozen former Varangians who have completed their service, who have accumulated their wealth and satisfied their oaths, and decided that it is time to return to lands they left years or decades ago. They stand at the rail watching the coast slip past, watching the water change from the deep blue of the open sea to the greyer tones of coastal waters. The wind is steady from the south, filling the ship's sail, pushing them northward at a pace that feels both too fast and too slow. Too fast because they are leaving behind a life, an identity, years of service and friendship and purpose. Too slow because they are eager now to see home, to complete this final journey, to begin the next phase of lives that have already been longer and stranger than anything they imagined in youth. They do not speak much. The companionship of warriors who have served together does not require constant conversation. They share the silence, each man absorbed in his own thoughts, his own memories, his own mixture of anticipation and regret that comes with endings and new beginnings. The chests they carry, heavy wooden boxes bound with iron, contain gold, Byzantine numismata, the famous gold coins that have held their value for centuries, that are recognized and accepted from England to Persia. Also jewelry, some of it taken during the palace plundering privilege, some purchased with wages accumulated over years. Fine textiles, silk that will be exotic and valuable in the north. Weapons, Byzantine swords that are superior to most northern blades. Books for those few who can read, Greek texts that will be treasures in northern monasteries or royal courts. This cargo of gold and goods represents transformed lives. These men who came south with nothing but their axes and their ambition are returning as wealthy men. They will buy land, marry well if they haven't already, establish families as people of substance and respect. Their service in Constantinople will give them status, will make them important figures in their communities. Children and grandchildren will hear stories about the ancestor who went to Miklagard and served the Roman emperor. But they are also carrying something less tangible. They are bringing back knowledge, experience, exposure to a civilization that was more sophisticated than anything in the north. They have seen marble palaces and golden mosaics. They have attended liturgies in churches that seem to touch heaven. They have learned Greek and observed Byzantine politics and absorbed ideas about government and culture and religion that will influence how they think for the rest of their lives. Some will adapt easily to life in the north, will settle back into Scandinavian or English or Slavic communities without obvious difficulty. Others will struggle, will find their homelands crude and provincial after Constantinople's magnificence, will be restless with the limited horizons of northern life. Some will become traders, using their Byzantine connections and knowledge. Others will enter royal service, bringing Byzantine ideas about kingship and administration to northern courts. A few will simply try to forget, to live quietly on their purchased farms, to put the Byzantine years behind them as something completed and separate from the life that comes after. The ship passes river deltas where the great waterways empty into the sea. These rivers are the road south, the path they took years ago coming to Constantinople. Now they will travel them in reverse, moving from the Black Sea up into the heartland of the Rus territories, through the lands where Norse and Slavic cultures mixed, toward the cold northern forests, and eventually to the Baltic and the Scandinavian homelands beyond. Night comes, and the ship anchors in a protected bay. The former guardsmen eat together, sharing preserved food and wine, talking quietly about logistics and plans. Tomorrow, they will continue north. In days or weeks, depending on where each man is going, they will separate, each heading to his own destination. The brotherhood forged in Byzantine service will dissolve, probably forever. They will become individuals again, separate men pursuing separate futures. But tonight they are still together, still bound by shared experience, still connected by the years they served side by side. They are the last generation, or nearly so, the final warriors of a tradition that is ending. After them, fewer will go south. The pipeline is closing. The circumstances that created the Varangian Guard are changing. These men in this ship are carrying the end of an era, witnesses to something that was remarkable and is now concluding. The water laps against the hull. The sky above is dark and full of stars, the same stars that shine over Constantinople, over the river routes, over the northern lands they are approaching. The air smells of salt and distance. And somewhere, in each man's chest, there is a weight, a complex mixture of relief and loss, of completion and emptiness. They have served, they have succeeded, they are going home. It is everything they wanted, and somehow it is not quite enough, will never be quite enough, because the man who arrives home is never quite the same man who left. And Constantinople changes everyone who serves her, leaves marks that no amount of gold can erase or compensate for, but the gold is real nonetheless. Heavy in the chest below deck, promise of transformed futures, and that will have to be enough. The legend lives. The Varangian Guard ended as an institution in the 14th century after Christ, but its story did not end. In the centuries that followed, the memory of these northern warriors who served Byzantine emperors grew and transformed, becoming legend, becoming part of the cultural inheritance of multiple peoples, inspiring stories and scholarship, and a kind of romantic fascination that persists to the present day. In Scandinavia, the Guard lived on in saga literature. The Norse sagas, written down in Iceland in the 13th and 14th centuries, but preserving older oral traditions, made frequent mention of warriors who went to Constantinople. Harald Hardrada was the most famous, his Byzantine service occupying a major portion of his saga. But there were many others. These saga accounts were not always historically accurate. They mixed fact with fiction freely, but they preserved the memory of Byzantine service as an important part of Norse culture. The runestones scattered across Sweden provide physical evidence of the Byzantine connection. More than 30 runestones mention warriors who travelled to Griqualand, the Greek lands, which meant Byzantine territories. These stones, erected by families to commemorate lost sons or brothers, give us names and fragments of stories. They tell of men who died in the East, who served the emperor, who travelled the river routes and never came home. They are melancholy monuments, markers of absence, but also proud declarations that someone from this farm, this family, had gone to the greatest city in the world and had been worthy of commemoration. In England, the memory of English warriors serving in Constantinople persisted for generations. The Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and later English chronicles mention men going east after the Norman conquest. English writers saw Byzantine service as an honourable alternative to accepting Norman rule, a way for dispossessed English nobility to maintain their warrior identity and their pride. This tradition of English service in the East influenced later English relations with the Byzantine world and contributed to English historical consciousness of connections to Mediterranean civilizations. In Byzantine culture, the Varangians were remembered with a mixture of respect and nostalgia. Byzantine chroniclers who wrote about the Guard emphasized their loyalty, often contrasting Varangian reliability with the political calculations of Byzantine nobles. The Guard became, in Byzantine memory, a symbol of simpler and perhaps better times, when the empire was stronger and more secure, when there existed warriors who served without ulterior motives, who could be trusted, absolutely. The archaeological record preserves traces of Varangian presence, Byzantine coins found in Scandinavian hoards, some bearing the names of emperors the guardsmen served, Norse weapons found in Byzantine territories, left behind by warriors who died far from home, graffiti carved into the marble balustrades of Hagia Sophia, Norse runes left by guardsmen whose names we can still read, though their lives are otherwise unknown, physical evidence that confirms the saga's tales, that proves this remarkable cultural exchange actually happened. Scholars have studied the Varangian Guard for centuries, producing books and articles that examine every aspect of their history. How were they recruited? How much were they paid? What battles did they fight? How did they relate to Byzantine society? What was their impact on Scandinavian culture? The scholarship continues to develop as new sources are discovered or old sources are reinterpreted. The Guard remains a subject of academic interest because it represents a unique historical phenomenon, a successful integration of foreign warriors into a sophisticated empire, a cultural bridge between civilizations that were otherwise quite separate. In popular culture, the Varangians have become almost mythical. Historical novels feature Varangian protagonists, imagining their lives in vivid detail. Video games include Varangian units, representing them as elite troops with special abilities. Historical reenactment societies study Varangian equipment and tactics, recreating their fighting style at medieval festivals. The Guard has entered that realm of history, where the line between fact and legend blurs, where the reality of what they were merges with the imagination of what they represent. What do they represent? Different things to different cultures, but perhaps universally they embody certain ideals. Loyalty that transcends political calculation. Honor that values oath-keeping above personal advantage. Courage tested repeatedly in desperate circumstances. The possibility of transformation, of a farm boy becoming a warrior who guards emperors. The romance of distant travel, of serving in exotic lands, of bridges between cultures. These are powerful themes, and they help explain why the Varangian story has such enduring appeal. The Guard also represents something about the Middle Ages that is often overlooked. The medieval world was more interconnected than we sometimes assume. Warriors from Scandinavia routinely travelled to Constantinople. Arab merchants traded in Scandinavia. Byzantine diplomacy reached as far as northern Europe. The Varangian Guard was part of this web of connections, one of the more dramatic examples, but representative of a larger pattern of interaction and exchange. For the modern observer, the Varangian Guard offers lessons about loyalty, cultural exchange, and historical contingency. Their loyalty was real, but also limited, bound by oaths that had specific terms and conditions. Their cultural exchange was bi-directional, with Byzantine culture influencing the guardsmen, even as Norse traditions influenced Byzantine military practice. And their history was contingent, dependent on specific circumstances that allowed the institution to flourish for several centuries, before changing conditions made it obsolete. The legacy is not just historical, but also inspirational. The story of young men leaving home, travelling impossible distances, serving with distinction in foreign lands, and returning transformed, is a universal story. It speaks to human ambitions and capabilities, to our ability to adapt and achieve in circumstances far removed from our origins. The Varangians who succeeded in Byzantine service did so not because they were superhuman, but because they combined courage with adaptability, maintained their core values while learning new ways, and understood that service in distant lands could be both burden and opportunity. In the end, the Varangian Guard matters not just because of what they accomplished militarily, though that was significant, but because of what they represented. They proved that loyalty could cross cultural boundaries. They demonstrated that foreign warriors could serve an empire faithfully without becoming a threat to that empire. They showed that gold and glory were real motivations that could drive men to extraordinary achievements. And they created a tradition that linked north to south, that made Constantinople and Scandinavia parts of the same story, that enriched both cultures through sustained interaction. The axes of the Varangian Guard no longer stand watch in the Great Palace. The palace itself is gone, destroyed or transformed beyond recognition over the centuries since the Byzantine Empire fell. Constantinople is now Istanbul, a Turkish city that still bears traces of its Byzantine past, but has been fundamentally transformed. The river routes that brought warriors south have been replaced by modern transportation networks. The world that created the Varangian Guard no longer exists. But the story survives. In sagas and chronicles, in runestones and archaeological finds, in scholarly books and popular retellings, the Varangian Guard lives on. Their service is remembered, their loyalty commemorated, their courage recognized. They remain part of our collective historical memory. These warriors who came from the frozen north to guard emperors in a city of gold, who kept their oaths across centuries and through impossible circumstances, who connected cultures and enriched histories, and left behind a legend that time cannot diminish or destroy. As the last light of history dims on the Varangian Guard, we are left with the essential truth of their service. They were warriors from the north who travelled impossible distances to serve an empire they did not fully understand, who kept oaths to emperors they might never have met before, swearing those oaths, who fought in battles far from home for causes that were not their own, and yet their service was not hollow or meaningless. It was, in its own way, profound. They transformed themselves and the world around them. The young warriors who left Scandinavian farms or English manors, who travelled the dangerous river routes to Constantinople, who took service in the Great Palace. These men were changed utterly by their experiences. They saw civilizations different from their own, learned that the Norse or English way was not the only way, absorbed knowledge and culture that they carried back north. Many never returned, died in battles from Sicily to Syria, were buried in foreign soil. But those who did return brought with them not just gold but ideas, Byzantine sophistication, meeting northern directness, creating something new. The Byzantine Empire benefited as well. The Guard provided security that native troops could not guarantee. It allowed emperors to feel safe in a system where palace coups were constant threats. It fought effectively in campaigns across the empire and beyond. And perhaps most importantly, it demonstrated the empire's ability to draw strength from distant peoples, to incorporate foreign warriors into Byzantine service without threatening Byzantine identity. The Guard was proof of the empire's cosmopolitan nature, its capacity to remain Roman while embracing the entire known world. 3 centuries is a long time for any institution to survive, let alone one as specific and unusual as the Varangian Guard. That it lasted from Basil II to the late Byzantine period speaks to its value, to how well it served the purposes for which it was created. When it finally faded away, it did so because the circumstances that created it had changed fundamentally, not because the institution itself had failed. Thank you for joining me through these historical reveries. May history's gentle embrace guide you to restorative slumber.